For centuries, before the first stone of any barrier was set, before a single engineer had drawn a line meant to hold back the tide, a great many people in the Netherlands went to sleep each night below the level of the sea that surrounded them. This was not a metaphor, and it was not an exaggeration born of later engineering pride. It was simply the arithmetic of the land itself. In some provinces, the fields lay 6 meters beneath the waterline at high tide, held dry only by the patient work of dikes, pumps, and windmills that had been rebuilt, generation after generation, by hands that understood that the sea did not forget and did not forgive carelessness. That single fact, a nation living below the height of the water beside it, is the quiet impossibility from which this entire story begins. And it is the reason that, decades later, the Netherlands would conceive and complete what remains, even now, the largest flood defense system ever built by human hands. The Delta Works. The Delta Works were not a single structure, though history sometimes remembers them that way. They were a chain of barriers, dams, sluices, and storm surge gates, strung across the mouths of the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt, where those rivers met the North Sea, each piece answering a different question the water had asked, each built in a different decade, with different materials and different machines, yet bound together by a single ambition: that the sea, which had already taken so much from this small country, would never again be allowed to take so much at once. To understand why such a system had to exist at all, why an entire nation would spend decades and treasure beyond easy counting on holding back the water, it helps to first understand what kind of land the Netherlands actually is, and what kind of relationship its people had already built with the sea long before the Delta Works were ever imagined. The land itself is, in a very real sense, borrowed. Much of the western and southwestern Netherlands did not rise from bedrock the way most countries do. It was laid down slowly over thousands of years by rivers carrying silt from the high ground of Germany and France, depositing their fine sediment each time they slowed and spread across the flatlands near the coast. Layer upon layer, season upon season, mud settled where water met resistance, and where the currents lost their strength. In time, marshes formed atop that silt, then peat, then thin soils capable of holding grass and reeds, and eventually capable of holding people. The rivers that built this land were also the rivers that threatened to reclaim it, and the sea beyond them was never a passive neighbor. It pressed inward constantly, testing every low place, finding every gap in the natural dunes, waiting with the patience that only water truly possesses. The earliest settlers of this region understood, long before engineering had a name, that they were living on a kind of truce. They built their homes on terpen, small raised mounds of earth constructed by hand, so that when the sea did break through, as it inevitably would, their houses might remain above the surface, even as the fields around them disappeared beneath brown, churning water. These were not distant, occasional disasters. They were expected. They were, in the language of the old chronicles, simply what the sea did, the way winter simply came each year, the way a river simply rose each spring. In this world, the water was not a distant abstraction. It was a constant presence, felt underfoot, smelled in the salt air, heard in the particular hush, before a storm gathered strength somewhere over open water and began to move toward the coast. And yet, from the very beginning, the relationship between the Dutch and the sea was never one of simple hostility. The same water that threatened to erase their fields also carried their trade, fed their fisheries, and later floated the ships that would make cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam among the wealthiest ports in the world. The sea gave as readily as it took. It brought fish in astonishing abundance to those willing to sail out and meet it. It carried goods from distant colonies into harbors that could not have existed without deep, accessible water at their doorstep. It shaped a national character that learned, slowly and at great cost, how to negotiate with something it could never fully control. The Dutch did not conquer the sea, and they rarely spoke as though they had. They negotiated with it, dike by dike, polder by polder, learning its moods the way a sailor learns the moods of a captain he cannot replace. This was the paradox at the center of Dutch life for nearly 1,000 years before the delta works were built. The sea as neighbor, provider, and executioner, sometimes within the same generation, sometimes within the same season. Villages that grew wealthy on trade routes crossing that same water might be erased within a single night when a storm surge found a weakness in an old dike, or when a high spring tide coincided with a northwesterly gale, strong enough to push the North Sea itself higher than the land could bear. The engineers of later centuries, the ones who would eventually conceive of concrete gates wide enough to swallow a cathedral, and dams built to withstand storms that came once in 10,000 years, inherited not a blank landscape, but a landscape already scarred again and again by the memory of water that had broken through before. That memory is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the emotional foundation beneath everything the delta works would later become. Every dike raised in the Netherlands before the 20th century was, in its own quiet way, an act of faith and defiance built atop the ruins of a dike that had failed. Fields reclaimed from the sea through centuries of patient pumping, land that Dutch engineers called polders, drained and kept dry only through constant, tireless mechanical effort, were themselves monuments to a nation's refusal to simply accept the shoreline the sea would have preferred to give them. Each windmill that turned along the horizon, lifting water from low fields into higher canals, was doing work that, if it ever stopped, would allow the land beneath it to slowly drown again. This was not once dramatic engineering. It was constant, unglamorous, essential labor, performed every day, in every season, for as long as anyone could remember. It is worth pausing here, gently before the deeper history unfolds, to consider what it might have felt like to live inside that arrangement. To raise children on land you understood, at some quiet level, was borrowed from the sea on conditions that could be revoked. The old stories carried this understanding plainly. Coastal villages kept records, sometimes only in memory, sometimes in church registers, of the great floods that had come before. The nights when bells rang out across low country in warning, when families climbed to whatever high ground existed, when morning revealed fields turned to shallow lakes and familiar landmarks simply gone. These were not distant myths from a forgotten age. They were living memory, passed from parent to child, embedded in place names, in the shapes of certain church towers built taller than seemed necessary, in the particular wariness with which older generations watched the sky when the wind shifted to the northwest in autumn. If you are settling in for the evening, this is a good moment to get comfortable, because the story that follows moves slowly and deliberately, the way the water itself moved across these lands over centuries, patient, persistent, and ultimately reshaping everything it touched. In the chapters ahead, we will walk together through the night that changed everything for the Netherlands, through the great and difficult questions that followed it, through the ground beneath the water and the materials chosen to meet it, and finally, through the rise of barriers and dams that would come to be known, collectively, as the delta works. If this kind of unhurried historical storytelling is something you enjoy, you are welcome to settle in and perhaps to subscribe for more stories like it, so that future chronicles of great human structures might find you again. But for now, let the story rest, and let us return to the land itself, and to the particular winter night when the old arrangement between the Netherlands and the sea finally, catastrophically, broke. Because for all the centuries of careful negotiation, for all the polders drained and dikes raised and windmills turned, The 20th century would eventually bring a storm, unlike any living memory had prepared the country to expect. It would arrive not as legend, but as fact, recorded in newspapers and government reports, and the quiet testimony of survivors who woke in the dark to water already inside their homes. That night would become the true beginning of the Delta Works, not the moment the barriers were designed, but the moment the nation finally understood, with total and unavoidable clarity, that the old defenses were no longer enough. It is to that night, and to the questions it forced an entire country to ask itself, that this story now turns. The night began, as so many disasters do, with nothing that seemed unusual at all. The first day of February in the year 1953 fell on a Sunday, and across Zeeland and the southwestern provinces of the Netherlands, people had gone about the ordinary business of a winter weekend. There had been wind, certainly, and a falling barometer that troubled some of the older fishermen and dike wardens who had spent their lives reading the sky and the water for signs. But wind and low pressure were not unusual in that stretch of coastline, where the North Sea met the mouths of great rivers in a tangle of islands and estuaries that had been fought over by land and tide for 1,000 years. What made this particular Sunday night different was a convergence that no single instrument or observer could have fully grasped as it was happening. A deep depression moving south from Scotland, a spring tide already running high, and a north-northwesterly gale that pushed the sea itself, over the course of hours, into a great swollen mass driving directly toward the funnel-shaped coastline of the Netherlands, Belgium, and eastern England. By the late evening, the water levels being recorded along the coast had already begun to exceed anything in living memory. But the warnings that existed moved slowly, if they moved at all. This was an age before satellite tracking, before the dense webs of sensors and computer models that would later allow storms to be watched almost as they formed. Weather information traveled by radio broadcast and telephone line, and on a Sunday night, with government offices closed and many communication networks running on skeleton staff, the news of what was coming did not reach the people who needed it most. In the villages of Zeeland, a province built almost entirely from land reclaimed from the sea over centuries, a place where the horizon was defined as much by dikes as by fields, most residents went to sleep as they always had, with the sound of the wind outside their windows, unaware that the sea had already begun to rise past the height the dikes were built to hold. The water came in the deep hours after midnight, in the stretch of darkness when a house is at its most silent and its occupants at their most defenseless. Dikes that had stood for generations, in some cases dikes that dated to the medieval reclamations that had first pulled this land from the sea, began to fail, not always through dramatic collapse, but often through a slower process of overtopping, the water simply rising over the crest and beginning to erode the landward side until the structure gave way entirely. In places where a dike broke, the sea did not arrive as a wave in the way that word suggests to modern ears familiar with tsunami footage. It arrived as a flood tide with tremendous force behind it, rushing through the breach and spreading with a speed that left almost no time for warning, no time for the slow accumulation of dread that might have allowed people to gather belongings, wake their neighbors, or reach higher ground. Survivors' accounts, recorded in the weeks and months afterward by government commissions and journalists, describe waking not to the sound of an alarm, but to the sound and feel of water already inside the house. Cold seawater moving through downstairs rooms, rising with a steadiness that gave the night an atmosphere of nightmare logic, where the impossible thing was simply and undeniably happening. The scale of what followed is difficult to convey without either understating its enormity or drifting into language that turns suffering into spectacle. And so it is best approached simply through the numbers and facts that the official record preserved. Over 150,000 hectares of land were flooded across the affected regions. More than 400 dikes were breached or destroyed outright. Tens of thousands of homes and farms were damaged beyond immediate use. And entire villages, small communities that had existed for generations behind the protection of their local dikes, found themselves partly or wholly submerged, their streets turned into channels of seawater, their church towers and rooftops becoming the only visible markers of where a settlement had once stood. Livestock drowned in numbers that devastated the agricultural communities of the region for years afterward, a loss that, while secondary to the human toll, compounded the economic and psychological wound left by the flood. The human cost, as recorded in the official accounts compiled by Dutch authorities in the aftermath, numbered over 1,800 deaths within the Netherlands alone, with additional lives lost in England and Belgium as the same storm system battered their coastlines that same night. These figures, drawn from government commissions and later historical review, are treated here not as a dramatic climax, but as a solemn record. The kind of number that a nation carries afterward, not as a statistic to be repeated for effect, but as a fact that shaped policy, memory, and grief for decades. Many of the dead were found in the days that followed, as rescue workers and volunteers moved through flooded villages by boat, searching houses that had, hours before, been ordinary homes with families sleeping inside them. Some communities lost a significant portion of their population in a single night. In parts of Zeeland, the flood took entire families together, a fact so painful in its particulars that most survivors and later historians chose to record it plainly without embellishment, letting the fact itself carry whatever weight it required. In the days immediately following the storm, the country found itself contending with a disaster of a scale it had not faced in generations. The Dutch armed forces, along with volunteers, church organizations, and ordinary citizens from unaffected regions, mobilized to rescue survivors still stranded on rooftops and upper floors, to distribute food and blankets, and to begin the grim work of accounting for the dead and assessing the damage. International aid arrived as well, a detail often noted with quiet gratitude in the historical record. Countries across Europe and beyond sent supplies, personnel, and expertise to help a nation that had, almost overnight, seen a significant portion of its southwestern territory rendered uninhabitable. The immediate relief effort, while imperfect and strained by the sheer scale of what had happened, was carried out with a determination that would itself become part of the national memory of the flood, not only the loss, but the response to it. Yet it was in the weeks that followed, as the water was slowly pumped and drained from the flooded polders and the extent of the disaster became fully clear, that the deeper and more lasting reckoning began. The flood of 1953 was not, in the strictest sense, an unprecedented event in Dutch history. The Netherlands had suffered great floods before: the St. Elizabeth flood of the 15th century, the All Saints flood of the 16th, various storm surges across the centuries that had reshaped the coastline and claimed lives in numbers that, by some estimates, exceeded even this most recent catastrophe. But 1953 arrived in a different world, a world of parliamentary government, engineering societies, insurance actuaries, newspapers with national circulation, and a population that had grown accustomed, in the years of post-war reconstruction, to believing that modern infrastructure and modern knowledge had rendered such disasters a relic of a less capable past. The flood shattered that assumption entirely, and it did so in a manner that could not be dismissed as an isolated act of unusual weather. It was, instead, understood almost immediately as a diagnosis, a demonstration that the existing system of dikes, accumulated over centuries through local and often uncoordinated efforts, was no longer adequate to the task of protecting a modern, densely populated delta region from the sea it had always lived beside. The political and emotional response that followed was, by most historical accounts, remarkably swift and remarkably unified for a country not always known for rapid consensus. Within weeks of the flood, the Dutch government had convened what would become known as the Delta Committee, a body of engineers, hydrologists, and government officials tasked with an undertaking that no engineering commission had ever quite faced at this scale before. The question placed before them was deceptively simple in its phrasing and almost unanswerable in its true difficulty. How does a nation permanently secure a coastline as long, as low, and as fractured by river mouths and estuaries as that of the southwestern Netherlands, in a way that would prevent a repetition of what had just occurred, not for a decade, but for generations to come? It was not a question that could be answered by raising the height of the existing dikes alone, though that work would indeed proceed in the years immediately following the flood as an urgent stopgap. The Delta Committee understood, almost from its earliest deliberations, that the true answer would require something far more ambitious, a fundamental reimagining of how the sea and the rivers of the Delta region should be separated from the populated land behind them. It is worth pausing in this account on the peculiar quiet with which this decision was made. There was no single dramatic proclamation, no ceremony marking the moment the nation resolved to build what would eventually become the Delta Works. Instead, there was the slow, sober accumulation of meetings, reports, surveys, and calculations, carried out by men and women who had, in many cases, personally witnessed the flooded villages or lost family and friends to the water. The Delta Committee's task, formally established in the aftermath of the flood, was to study the entire complex of estuaries, tidal channels, and river mouths that made the Dutch southwest so vulnerable, and to propose a coordinated system of defences that could close off the sea's access to the most exposed inlets, while preserving, where necessary, the routes that shipping and fresh water still required. It was a mandate that would occupy the country's engineers for decades to come, a project whose full scope, cost, and duration were not yet imagined on the night the committee first convened, but whose necessity had been made undeniable in a single night in February, when the sea had risen over dikes built by generations long past, and reminded a modern nation of an old and patient truth, that the water remembers where it once was and does not forget its way back. To understand what the engineers faced when they unrolled their charts across long tables in the weeks after the flood, one had first to understand the shape of the land itself, a shape that had never been simple and had never been kind to those who tried to defend it. The southwestern provinces of the Netherlands were not a coastline in the way that word suggested, to those who thought of coasts as clean lines drawn between land and sea. They were instead a labyrinth, a slow accumulation of centuries during which rivers descending from the heart of Europe, the Rhine, the Maas, the Scheldt, had reached the end of their long journeys and, rather than meeting the sea in a single mouth, had splintered into dozens of channels, branching and rejoining, carving islands from what had once been solid ground, leaving behind a delta so intricate that no single map of it looked quite the same as the one before. For the water itself was still shifting the land it passed through, grain by grain, season by season, as it had done for thousands of years before any dike had been raised against it. This was the puzzle the engineers now had to solve, and it was not a puzzle with an obvious answer. A conventional coastline, one might reason, could be defended with a single sea wall, a long, unbroken barrier facing the water directly, its length determined simply by the distance from one end of the exposed shore to the other. But Zeeland and the surrounding provinces offered no such simplicity. Instead, there were estuaries, wide, deep-mouthed openings where river met sea, and where the sea, in turn, could push its way inland for many miles, before the water grew calm enough to be called a river again. Each estuary was, in effect, a door, and behind every door lay a further branching of channels, islands, and polders, each low-lying stretch of reclaimed land ringed by its own modest dike. adequate perhaps for an ordinary tide, but never designed to withstand what had come that February night. To draw a line around every island, every inlet, every low field reclaimed from the sea over the centuries, would have meant building and maintaining thousands of kilometers of dikes, an impossible burden for a small nation already strained by the costs of recovery, and one that offered no real security even if it could somehow be achieved. For a chain is only as strong as its weakest length, and here there were thousands of lengths, any one of which might fail again in some future storm that no one could yet predict. The engineers understood then that the old approach, patching, raising, reinforcing dikes one at a time, village by village, as had been done for generations, could not answer a threat of this scale. What was needed was not defense at every point, but a rethinking of where the points of defense should be at all. It was here that a principle began to take shape, discussed first in the cautious language of committee reports and technical memoranda, a principle that would later become known simply as the Delta Plan, though in those early months it had no such settled name, only the outline of an idea taking form on paper. That the way to protect a jagged, estuary-riddled coast was not to defend its every inlet individually, but to close off the largest and most exposed of those inlets entirely, sealing them with barriers built across their mouths, and in doing so to shorten, quite literally, the total length of coastline that faced the open sea. If an estuary could be closed at its narrowest point, near where it met the sea, then all the many kilometers of vulnerable dike lining the islands and polders further inland, dikes that had failed only months before, could be left to guard only a tamed, tidal river rather than the sea itself. A river whose surges would be gentler, whose tides would be softened, whose threat would be, if not eliminated, then greatly reduced. It was an elegant idea, in the way that the best engineering ideas are elegant, not because it was simple to execute, for it was not, but because it reframed the entire problem. Rather than measuring the task in the thousands of kilometers of inland dikes that crisscrossed the delta, the engineers could now measure it in the mere handful of kilometers of open water at each estuary's mouth that needed to be closed. It was, in the language later used to describe it, an act of shortening the coast, of turning a long and porous frontier into a shorter and more defensible one, of trading many small vulnerable points for a few large, deliberately chosen and heavily fortified ones. But to arrive at this insight was only the beginning, for the question immediately became which inlets to close, and this was where the calculation grew far more delicate than any single principle could resolve on its own. Not every estuary could simply be sealed. The engineers had to weigh, inlet by inlet, a set of considerations that often pulled in opposite directions. There was the matter of shipping, for the mouth of the Nieuwe Waterweg, the channel that led to the port of Rotterdam, could not be closed without severing one of the busiest and most economically vital waterways in Europe, a route along which ocean-going vessels carried the cargo that fed much of the nation's commerce. To dam that channel as one might dam a quiet estuary further south would have been to trade one form of catastrophe for another, replacing the risk of flood with the certainty of economic strangulation. There was also the matter of fresh water, for several of the delta's channels carried river water essential to agriculture and to the drinking supplies of towns and farms further inland, and to seal them entirely, without accounting for how fresh water would still reach those who depended on it, risked creating a new crisis even as the old one was solved. And there was, though it would take some years yet before it was given full weight in the planning, the matter of the estuaries themselves as living systems, the tidal flats and mussel beds and fishing grounds that depended on the regular exchange of seawater, communities of oystermen and fishermen whose livelihoods were tied to waters that a fully sealed dam would render still and brackish, no longer part of the sea's daily rhythm. So the engineers set about a slow, exhaustive process of measurement and argument, charting the width and depth of each inlet, the volume of shipping that passed through it, the acreage of farmland behind it that depended on its fresh water, the tidal flows that sustained its ecology, weighing all of this against the storm surge risk each inlet posed, and the length of inland dike that closing it might save. Some estuaries, narrow and already lightly used, presented themselves as clear candidates for closure. The Brielse, for instance, small enough that a dam across it seemed feasible within a matter of years rather than decades. Others, wider and deeper, would require structures far beyond anything yet built in the country, structures whose engineering had not yet been invented and would have to be devised specifically for this task. And the mouth leading to Rotterdam's harbour, it was decided early on, could not be closed by any conventional dam at all, but would instead require something else entirely, something that did not yet have a name or a precedent anywhere in the world, an idea that would not fully mature for another 3 decades. What emerged from this process was not a single answer, but a graduated plan, a hierarchy of closures ranging from complete dams at the smaller, less vital inlets to movable barriers at the larger ones where shipping had to be preserved, with the whole arrangement designed so that the total exposed coastline of the southwestern Netherlands would be reduced from many hundreds of kilometers of individual dikes to a far smaller number of major closure points, each one to be built strong enough to withstand a storm, calculated not from ordinary experience, but from the statistical extremes of recorded tides, wind speeds, and surges stretching back as far as the records allowed, extended further still by calculations of probability meant to guard against a flood that might occur only once in many thousands of years. Even as the shape of this plan began to solidify on paper, those who drew it understood that they were not describing a project that could be completed within their own careers. The scale of what was being proposed, barriers across some of the widest tidal inlets in Europe, dams sunk into some of the deepest and most treacherous channels on the continent, movable gates engineered to a precision that did not yet exist in Dutch practice, was scale measured not in years, but in decades. A project that would begin with the engineers who had stood over the floodwaters in February and would not conclude until long after many of them had retired or passed from the profession altogether, handed forward to a second and even a third generation of engineers who would inherit both the unfinished dams and the accumulated knowledge of those who had begun them. There was, in the committee's early reports, a quiet acknowledgement of this, not stated as complaint or hesitation, but simply as fact. The plain recognition that a nation reshaping its own edge against the sea was undertaking something closer to a geological project than a construction one, closer to the slow work of rivers and tides than to the erection of a single building or bridge. And so, in those early months, amid the surveying and the arguing and the careful weighing of shipping lanes against storm risk, against fresh water, against the quiet economies of oystermen who had fished these waters for generations, there settled over the work a particular kind of gravity, the gravity that comes from recognizing that what is being planned will outlast the planners, that the coastline being redrawn on these charts would still be standing, in some form, long after the hands that drew it had gone still. A recognition that did not slow the work, but gave it, from its very beginning, the unhurried, deliberate patience of something built not for a season or a decade, but for the long memory of the sea itself. Beneath every line drawn on those charts lay a country that no engineer had yet seen, and it was to this hidden country that the work now turned its attention. For the Zeeland estuaries were not simply channels of water waiting to be closed, but living systems of sand and silt and current that had been shifting and reshaping themselves for thousands of years before anyone thought to hold them still. The rivers Rhine, Meuse and Scheldt did not empty into the sea so much as argue with it. their fresh water pushing outward against the tide's slow insistence. And in that ancient argument, they had carved a labyrinth of channels beneath the surface, some shallow enough to wade in low tide, others plunging 30 meters or more into darkness, gouged out by centuries of water, moving with a patience greater than any human patience yet devised. To close these openings, the engineers first had to know them, and knowing them meant descending into a realm that resisted description, let alone measurement. For the seabed of Zealand was not stone, was not even settled sand, but something closer to a suspension, a shifting mass that could bear weight in the morning and swallow it by afternoon, that could hold firm through a calm week and liquefy entirely under the pressure of a single, strong tide. The first surveys began not with construction, but with sounding small boats moving slowly across the mouths of the estuaries, lowering weighted lines and, later, primitive echo devices, recording depths that seemed to change not just season to season, but tide to tide, so that a channel measured as 18 meters deep in spring might return in autumn as 22. The difference being not measurement error, but the seabed itself in motion, sand migrating along the bottom in slow rivers of its own, indifferent to the human need for fixed numbers. The engineers who undertook this work, men trained in the traditions of Dutch hydraulic engineering that stretched back centuries, to the builders of the old sea dikes and the polders reclaimed from marsh and lake, understood from the outset that they were not measuring a static thing. They were attempting to characterize a process, and the difference between those two tasks would define nearly every decision that followed. Alongside the soundings came the borings, long steel tubes driven down through the seabed to draw up cores of what lay beneath. Layer upon layer of clay, peat and sand deposited across geological ages, each layer telling its own quiet story of ancient shorelines, buried forests, and the slow subsidence of a delta that had been sinking, almost imperceptibly, since long before written history. These cores, laid out afterward in the laboratories of the Rijkswaterstaat, the government service charged with managing the nation's waters, were read the way a physician might read tissue samples, each stratum interpreted for what it could bear, what it might resist, and what it would inevitably surrender to should the wrong structure be built above it. In some places, the borings found firm sand close to the surface, promising ground for a foundation. In others, they found peat, soft and compressible, capable of settling for years under a load, threatening to swallow whole any barrier set too confidently upon it. The map that slowly emerged from this work was not the clean blue expanse shown on ordinary charts, but a mottled, uncertain document full of qualifications and shaded uncertainties. A portrait of ground that could not simply be trusted. It was this uncertainty, more than any single technical obstacle, that shaped the years before construction truly began. To build across open water is, in the most basic sense, to fight against motion. The motion of tide, of current, of storm, and of the seabed itself. And the engineers understood early that every structure they raised would need not merely to withstand the water's force in the moment of building, but to endure it across decades, through tides that came twice daily, forever, without pause, without exception, without any regard for the concrete or steel now standing in their path. Where a bridge might be built across firm ground and simply endure the load of traffic above it, a sea barrier had to endure an adversary that never rested, that tested every joint and every foundation with the same patient insistence, day after day, century after century. This asymmetry between the fixed intention of the engineers and the endless variability of the sea became the quiet governing principle of the entire project's early years. The difficulty of working in moving water revealed itself most starkly in the estuary called the Oosterschelde, the Eastern Scheldt, whose tidal channels ran deep and whose currents, at full ebb or flood, could reach speeds that made ordinary construction methods almost useless. To sink a foundation into such a channel was to place something solid into a river that never stopped moving, and the early attempts to do so taught the engineers, through failure as much as success, how unforgiving that river could be. Sandbags lowered into the current were carried sideways before they settled. Temporary cofferdams, built to hold back water so that dry work might proceed within, were themselves undermined by the very currents they sought to exclude. Water finding its way beneath and around barriers meant to be impermeable, scouring at their edges until they gave way. Each failure was recorded, studied, and folded into the next attempt, for there was no other way forward. The sea offered no shortcuts, and every lesson had to be paid for in the same slow currency of trial and patient revision. It was in response to this resistance that the engineers turned to an older technique, refined now for a scale it had rarely been asked to serve: the sinking of caissons, immense hollow structures of concrete or steel, built on land or in dry dock, then floated out to the site and deliberately flooded, so that they would settle into place upon the seabed, forming instant foundations far more massive than anything that could be assembled underwater by human hands. The principle was simple enough to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute at the scale the estuaries demanded. For a caisson large enough to serve as a foundation section for a barrier spanning hundreds of meters of open water had to be built to tolerances fine enough to control its sinking precisely, and it had to be floated and towed and positioned within a landscape of channels that shifted their depths from one season to the next. Early experiments were modest in scale, small caissons tested in sheltered inlets where the currents were forgiving, the engineers watching and measuring how each structure settled, how it resisted the pull of tide during descent, how the seabed responded once the great weight came finally to rest upon it. Before any of this could be attempted at true scale in the open estuaries, though, there was another stage of patience required, one that took place not on the water at all, but in laboratories built to mimic it. The flumes, long channels of controlled water flow constructed at research facilities, where scaled models of proposed dikes and barriers could be tested against artificial tides and simulated storms without risking a single life or a single guilder of public expense on a structure not yet proven sound. In these flumes, tiny versions of proposed dams were built from scaled sand and gravel, then subjected to currents calibrated to represent, in miniature, the forces the real estuaries would bring to bear, and the engineers watched, sometimes for weeks at a time, as scale models either held their form or crumbled under simulated tides. Each failure in the flume a warning against a failure that might otherwise occur at full scale, with the sea itself as the unforgiving judge. It was slow work, the kind that offered no dramatic breakthroughs, only the steady accumulation of confidence, model after model, failure after failure, until a design emerged that could be trusted to hold, at least in principle, against the forces the coast would one day present. This period of study, of sounding and boring and flume testing, of small failures endured deliberately so that greater failures might later be avoided, stretched across years before the first true construction began in earnest. And there were those, even among engineers sympathetic to the project's aims, who wondered whether such caution was itself a kind of extravagance, whether a nation still recovering from the flood's devastation could afford so patient an approach when the next storm might arrive before the barriers were ready. But the men directing the work understood something that the urgency of memory could not easily accommodate, that a structure built in haste upon ground not yet understood was a structure built toward its own eventual failure, that the sea's patience was, in its own way, infinite, and that any human patience shorter than the sea's own would eventually be found wanting. And so the surveys continued, the borings multiplied, the flumes ran their slow simulated tides, and the seabed of Zealand was measured and mapped again, until at last, the ground beneath the water, resistant as it was to certainty, yielded enough of its secrets that the engineers could begin, with whatever confidence such shifting foundations allowed, to draw not merely lines upon a chart, but structures meant to stand upon the actual, unseen floor of the sea itself. Before a single stone could be set upon that seabed, an entire geography of supply had to be assembled, and this labor, though it lacked the drama of a closing gap or a rising gate, consumed years of its own and called upon a landscape far wider than Zealand alone. The engineers had determined what the ground could bear and what the water would demand, but knowing this was only the beginning of a longer reckoning. Where would the stone come from, and the sand, and the great volumes of concrete that no single quarry or works could hope to provide alone? The answer, when it came, drew the project outward across borders, so that the building of a Dutch sea defence became, in its quiet way, an international undertaking, dependent on the rock of Belgium and the quarries of Germany, on rivers and rail lines and the patient turning of barges through canals that had never been built to carry cargo of this weight or purpose. The stone itself, gathered in quantities that the engineers themselves found difficult to render into ordinary comprehension, came largely from the quarries of the Ardennes, where blasted granite and basalt had for generations been cut for lesser purposes, and where now entire hillsides were given over to the singular task of feeding the delta works. The rock was graded by size and by weight, for not all stone was suited to the same task. The smaller fragments, some no larger than a fist, would form the underlayers upon which greater weights might rest, while the larger blocks, some exceeding several tons apiece, were reserved for the outer armor of the dams and barriers. The pieces meant to break the sea's own force before it could reach anything more vulnerable beneath. This sorting was not a matter of convenience, but of physics, for the engineers understood, as their predecessors had understood in smaller ways for centuries, that a wall built of uniform stone would fail where the sea found its single weakness, while a wall built of graduated weight, coarse below and heavy above, might absorb and dissipate the water's energy across many surfaces, rather than concentrating it upon one. From Germany came yet more stone, and gravel besides, hauled by barge along the Rhine and its tributaries before being redirected into the Dutch waterway system, a network of canals and channels that had, over centuries, been dug and dredged and maintained precisely for such purposes, though never before at such volume. The barges themselves, flat-bottomed and built for capacity rather than speed, moved in slow procession toward the delta, each one carrying a portion of a mountain that had, until recently, stood undisturbed for longer than human memory could account for. It was said, though the sources vary on the particulars, that the total tonnage of stone eventually delivered to the delta works exceeded that used in some of the great pyramids and cathedrals of earlier ages. Though such comparisons, however evocative, were rarely the concern of the engineers themselves, who thought less in terms of monuments than in terms of tolerances, of sheer strength, of the particular resistance a given stone might offer against the particular force of a particular tide. The sand, unlike the stone, required no importation from foreign quarries, for the seabed itself provided this material in what seemed, at least at first glance, an inexhaustible supply. Dredgers, some newly designed for this very purpose, worked the seafloor beyond the immediate construction zones, drawing up sand in great volumes and depositing it where the engineers required foundation or fill. This dredged sand became the bed upon which stone would rest, the leveling layer that smoothed the irregularities of the natural seafloor into something approaching the uniformity that construction demanded. Yet the sand brought its own complications, for sand dredged and redeposited did not behave as sand long settled by the slow patience of geological time. It required consolidation, testing, sometimes repeated re-dredging where currents had disturbed it, before the heavier stone could be laid above. The engineers learned, through trial and through the sea's own tutelage, that even something as seemingly simple as the placement of sand demanded a discipline the ocean was in no hurry to teach gently. Concrete, the third of the great materials, was not gathered but made, and its making required an infrastructure entirely new to the region. Purpose-built casting yards rose along the Zeeland coast, their names now recorded in Dutch engineering histories with the same quiet respect once reserved for shipyards or ironworks. Places where cement, aggregate and water were combined and poured into molds of a size and precision that civilian construction had rarely required before. Here were cast the great caissons, hollow structures of concrete large enough to be towed as vessels themselves, destined to be sunk into position and filled with sand or stone until they settled, permanent and immovable, into the gaps the sea had once occupied freely. The concrete used in these structures was engineered to particular specifications, resistant to the chemical erosion that saltwater visits upon ordinary construction, dense enough to withstand the abrasion of moving sand and shifting stone across decades rather than years. The engineers who developed these formulations drew on lessons learned from harbour works and lighthouse foundations built in earlier generations, adapting old knowledge to a scale those earlier builders could scarcely have imagined necessary. It was in this period that the artificial islands appeared, structures without precedent in Dutch engineering, built not as permanent features of the delta, but as temporary platforms from which the deeper work might proceed. These islands, raised from sand and enclosed by rings of stone, allowed cranes and construction crews to work in positions that open water would otherwise have denied them, providing solid ground, however manufactured, in places where solid ground had never existed. The islands were themselves a kind of experiment, tested first at smaller scale before being attempted at the size the delta works required, and their success, though rarely celebrated with the same attention given to the dams and barriers they helped construct, represented one of the quieter triumphs of the entire project. Proof that the engineers could, when necessary, manufacture not merely structures, but the very ground upon which structures might be built. Beneath all of this, protecting the seabed itself from the scouring action of tide and current disturbed by construction, the engineers laid what they came to call mattresses, woven from willow branches harvested from Dutch and Belgian coppices and bound together into great flexible mats, sometimes reinforced with asphalt to resist decay and to add weight sufficient to hold them against the current. This technique, though it employed the humblest of materials, drew upon centuries of Dutch experience with willow work in dike construction, adapted now to depths and pressures the old dike builders had never faced. The mattresses were floated into position and then sunk, weighted with stone to form a flexible skin across the seafloor that would yield slightly to the water's movement without breaking, protecting the sand and clay beneath from the erosion that unprotected ground would otherwise have suffered as the structures above began to alter the sea's natural flow. It was, in its way, a marriage of the ancient and the modern. Willow branches, a material Dutch builders had understood for centuries, deployed in service of a project whose scale belonged entirely to the 20th century. Each material, in the end, was chosen not from habit or convenience, but from a careful weighing of what the sea would ask of it. Stone was chosen for its mass, for its resistance to the shifting the tide would otherwise inflict upon anything lighter. Sand was chosen for its availability and its capacity to be shaped, though it demanded constant vigilance against redistribution by the very currents it was meant to resist. Concrete was chosen for its permanence, its capacity to be cast into forms no natural material could achieve, and for its resistance to the chemical assault that seawater visits upon lesser substances across the slow accumulation of years. Willow, the humblest of these materials, was chosen for its flexibility, for its capacity to bend without breaking, beneath a force that rigid materials would eventually resist to their own destruction. Together, these materials formed a kind of alliance against the sea's own patience, each contributing what the others could not, none sufficient alone to hold back a force so vast and so persistent. Behind all of this stood the quiet, unglamorous machinery of logistics. The barges that never stopped moving, the cranes that lifted stone and caisson alike with a precision the earlier dike builders could scarcely have imagined. The schedules that had to account for tide and weather and the availability of vessels drawn from across the wider Dutch and European shipping trade. Warehouses rose along the coast to store materials awaiting their turn, and new roads were cut through farmland to allow trucks to reach construction sites that had, only years before, been reachable only by boat or not at all. This was an army of materials, gathered slowly and without haste, moved into position across years rather than months, until the coastline of Zeeland began to resemble less a natural shore than a vast and patient staging ground. Prepared at last for the work the engineers had so long delayed, while the ground beneath the water yielded up its secrets. One survey, one boring, one slow calculation at a time. For a time, it seemed the plan was settled. The original Delta scheme, drawn up in the years following the flood, called for the simplest answer the engineers could conceive. Close every estuary mouth with a solid dam, seal the sea away entirely, and let the rivers behind find their own quiet accommodation with the land. It was a philosophy inherited from centuries of Dutch water management, in which the sea was treated as an adversary to be shut out, its tides and surges denied entry altogether. The dams at Veer and Zandkreek had already been built this way, solid barriers of stone and clay that transformed tidal channels into still, freshwater lakes. It was, by the standards of the age, a proven method, and there was no reason at first to imagine that the Eastern Scheldt would be treated any differently. But as the years passed and the surveys deepened, a different kind of understanding began to settle over the project, one that had less to do with engineering than with the slow, patient observations of biologists and fishermen who had watched the Eastern Scheldt through generations of tides. The estuary was not simply a gap in the coastline waiting to be closed. It was a living system, its waters rich with mussels and oysters, cultivated across centuries, its channels home to fish that depended on the twice-daily rhythm of salt water moving in and out with the moon. To dam it fully, as the earlier projects had done elsewhere, would be to still that rhythm forever, turning a working sea into a static lake and ending in a single act of concrete and clay, an industry that had sustained coastal communities since before the records began. The objection did not arrive all at once, nor did it arrive with anger. It came slowly, through letters to ministries, through meetings in town halls where oyster farmers stood alongside engineers and asked, calmly enough, what would become of their livelihoods once the tide was gone. It came through the growing voice of a new ecological awareness taking hold across Europe in those years, one that questioned whether progress and preservation could still be reconciled, or whether one must always be sacrificed for the other. The engineers of the Delta Works, who had spent years proving that water could be mastered through sufficient calculation and sufficient concrete, found themselves confronted with a question their training had not fully prepared them for. Not how to close the sea away, but how to let it remain while still holding back its worst violence. The answer, when it came, represented one of the great conceptual shifts in the history of coastal engineering. Rather than a solid dam sealing the estuary entirely, the engineers proposed something that had, in its scale and ambition, no true precedent anywhere in the world. A barrier that would stand open under ordinary conditions, allowing the tide to move freely in and out as it always had, and would close only when the sea grew dangerous. holding back the surge for the hours it took the storm to pass before opening again to let the rhythm resume. It was, in essence, a compromise made physical, an attempt to satisfy the ecologists who wished the tide preserved and the flood engineers who wished the coast protected, without asking either to fully surrender their claim. The idea was elegant in its statement and immensely difficult in its execution. A solid dam required only that the engineers understand how to build a wall strong enough to resist water pressing against it from one direction, permanently, for as long as the structure stood. A movable barrier required something else entirely. Gates massive enough to hold back a storm surge, measured in meters of accumulated water, yet mechanically capable of rising and lowering on command, tested and retested across decades of service, never failing at the one moment when failure could not be permitted. It required foundations stable enough to carry the enormous static and dynamic loads of moving steel and concrete, in conditions of tide and current that had already proven difficult enough for the sunken caissons and simple dams built elsewhere in the delta. And it required, above all, an engineering imagination willing to abandon the old certainty of solid closure in favor of a system that must, by its very design, remain forever unfinished, forever waiting, its purpose fulfilled only in the rare hours when the sea turned dangerous. The design that emerged called for a line of massive concrete pillars, each one a structure in its own right, sunk into the seabed across the width of the estuary mouth, spaced at intervals wide enough to allow the channel's natural flow to pass largely undisturbed. Between these pillars would hang enormous steel gates, sliding vertically within their concrete frames, capable of being lowered to seal the gaps entirely when storm surge threatened, and raised again once the danger passed to let the tide resume its ordinary work. The pillars themselves would need to be among the largest concrete elements ever constructed for a marine environment. Their bases wide enough to resist not only the sideways push of tidal current, but the immense additional load of the gates once closed against a rising sea. It was a structure that asked to be built like a bridge and to function like a dam, and no engineer working on the project could point to an existing barrier anywhere that had attempted quite the same thing at quite this scale. The scale of the undertaking, once fully understood, brought with it years of delay, and this delay is remembered now not as failure but as a kind of patient negotiation carried out across drafting tables, ministry offices, and public hearings, in which the country slowly worked out what it wished the Delta Works to become. There were engineers who argued the closed dam approach remained simpler, cheaper, and more certain, pointing to the successful closures already completed elsewhere in the Delta as proof that the old method worked and needed no reinvention. There were ecologists who argued that even the movable barrier represented too great a compromise, that any structure spanning the estuary would alter its currents and its life in ways no calculation could fully predict. There were fishermen and shellfish farmers who wanted assurance, difficult to give with total certainty, that their waters would remain much as they had always been. And there were the ordinary costs of any project of this size, weighed against a national budget that had other calls upon it as the 1960s gave way to a new decade. The debate consumed years rather than months, and it is remembered in the archives not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady accumulation of reports, revised designs, and parliamentary discussions, each one narrowing the distance between the competing visions until, by the middle of the 1970s, a design had been settled that could be built. The delay cost time and cost money, and it is recorded honestly in the histories of the project as a period when the Delta Works, for all its early momentum, slowed nearly to stillness while the nation decided what kind of relationship it wished to have with the sea going forward. But the delay also produced, in the end, a structure more thoughtful than the one first proposed, one that reflected not only the engineering knowledge of its age, but the values the country had come to hold about the water it lived beside. It is in this decision, more than in any single technical achievement, that historians of the Delta Works locate the deeper shift in Dutch engineering philosophy that the storm surge barrier represents. For centuries, the relationship between the Netherlands and the sea had been framed in the language of conquest. Land reclaimed, water expelled, dikes raised ever higher to deny the sea its ancient claim upon the low ground. The flood of 1953 had at first seemed to confirm this framing entirely, offering proof that the sea must simply be shut out more completely, more permanently, wherever it threatened to return. But the debate over the Oosterschelde introduced a different understanding, one in which the water was not simply an enemy to be excluded, but a system to be lived alongside, respected for what it sustained as much as feared for what it could destroy. The storm surge barrier, in this sense, was not merely a compromise between competing interests. It was the physical expression of a new philosophy, one in which safety and coexistence were no longer treated as opposites, but as two demands that a sufficiently patient engineering might learn to satisfy together. The pillars themselves had not yet risen from the seabed. The gates had not yet been forged, but the decision had been made, after years of careful argument, and the coastline of Zeeland, already scattered with staging grounds and quarried stone, now waited for a structure the world had not yet seen attempted at this scale, one that would neither surrender to the sea nor seal it away, but learn, through steel and concrete and endless patient calculation, to hold the door open until the moment it needed, quietly and completely, to close. The building of those pillars began not at the sea, but beside it, in a place carved specifically for the purpose and unlike anything the Dutch coast had held before. At Jans, an artificial island raised from reclaimed ground in the mouth of the estuary, engineers had ordered the construction of a dry dock of a size that strained the imagination of those accustomed to smaller works. It was here, in basins large enough to hold a fleet of ships, that the first of the barrier's massive concrete pillars would be cast, each one a structure in its own right before it ever touched the water it was built to hold back. The work of shaping these pillars followed no simple pattern. Each stood as tall as a 10-story building, and each was hollow through its center, a chamber of concrete and steel reinforcement bent to withstand pressures that no ordinary foundation would ever meet. The formwork alone took months to construct, vast wooden and steel molds standing like the ribs of some enormous vessel, waiting to receive the concrete that would be poured in careful, measured stages. Workers moved along scaffolding suspended high above the dock floor, checking reinforcement bar by bar, tying steel with the same unhurried attention a shipwright might give to the framing of a hull. According to surviving accounts from engineers who supervised the pours, a single pillar could require several thousand cubic meters of concrete, delivered not in one great rush, but across days, each layer allowed to settle and cure before the next was added, so that the finished mass would carry no hidden weakness within it. 65 of these piers were eventually cast in the dry dock at Jans, each one nominally identical in form, but subtly adjusted according to where, along the estuary's floor, it would ultimately rest. The bed of the Oosterschelde was not a uniform surface. It rose and dipped, shifted in composition from sand to clay to compacted shell, and each pillar's base had to be shaped, in part, to answer the particular contour of ground it would meet. Engineers who had spent years surveying the estuary floor now saw their measurements translated into the concrete forms taking shape before them, a strange and quiet collaboration between the abstract data of soundings and the physical mass of the piers themselves. When a pillar was finished and had cured to the required strength, the dry dock in which it stood was flooded, slowly, so that the great structure could be floated free of the ground that had held it during its making. This alone was regarded by many of the engineers as one of the more delicate operations in the entire program. For a pillar of that size, once buoyant, behaved unlike anything on land. It shifted with the smallest imbalance of water pressure and had to be guided with caution as it left the dock, carried out toward open water where it would meet the vessel built specifically to carry it to its final resting place. That vessel was among the most singular pieces of equipment produced for the entire Delta Works. A catamaran-hulled crane ship, known to those who built and operated it simply as the giant lifting vessel, though its formal name in the records was Austria. Built with twin hulls, spaced wide enough to straddle a pillar and lift it clear of the water between them, the vessel could raise a structure weighing several thousand tons and hold it steady while the ship itself moved out across the estuary toward the exact coordinates where that pillar belonged. To watch it work, according to those who observed the operation from shore, was to see something that seemed to defy the ordinary logic of construction. A mass of concrete taller than most buildings in the surrounding towns, suspended between two hulls, gliding slowly across open water as though weightless, though every person aboard understood precisely how much weight it carried and how little room there was for error. Beneath the water, the seabed itself had already been prepared to receive each pillar, a process almost as demanding as the casting of the piers themselves. Before any pillar could be lowered into place, the estuary floor at that location had to be leveled and stabilized. The loose sand and silt built up into a firm foundation mattress capable of bearing the enormous point loads that would be transferred down through the base of the pier. This mattress work, carried out by specialized vessels equipped with sensors and remotely guided placement systems, was itself a form of underwater construction, requiring its own patience, since currents in the estuary shifted constantly, and any settlement of material had to be checked and corrected before the pillar above it could be trusted to stand. Once the seabed was ready and the lifting vessel had brought its pillar into position, the true test of the entire operation began. Divers and surveyors aboard support vessels worked to guide the placement, communicating through cables and signal lines with the crane operators above, calling for adjustments measured not in meters but in centimeters, sometimes less. A pillar weighing several thousand tons had to be lowered onto its prepared foundation within a tolerance so narrow that many outside the profession found it difficult to believe when first told the figures. The placement needed to be accurate enough that the pillar's base met the mattress evenly across its entire footprint. For an uneven bearing, even a slight one, could in time lead to settlement, tilting, or stress fractures that no repair crew could easily reach once the structure was submerged and locked into the surrounding system of gates and sills. The engineers who oversaw this work often spoke, in the records that survive from the period, of an unusual quiet that settled over the operation during the final phase of each placement. Cranes that had groaned and strained through the earlier lifting stages grew still. Communication over the radios slowed to short, careful phrases. One project engineer, recalling the process years later, described the final lowering of a pillar as something closer to a held breath than an act of machinery. The crew watching gauges and position markers with the same attention a surgeon might give to the final motion of a difficult procedure, aware that thousands of tons of concrete now depended entirely on decisions made in fractions of a meter. It was demanding work, and it fell to a workforce that had, by this stage of the Delta Works, grown accustomed to labor of a kind seldom asked of construction crews anywhere else. Many of the men who operated the cranes and guided the placements had spent years on the project already, moving from the seawalls and dams of the earlier phases into this newer and stranger discipline of underwater precision engineering. Surviving interviews and internal newsletters from the Rijkswaterstaat, the public works authority responsible for the barrier, describe a workforce that took evident pride in the exactness of their labor. some crews keeping informal records of how closely each pillar had been set to its intended mark, treating the numbers almost as a personal measure of craftsmanship. One account recalls workers gathering at the rail of a support vessel to watch a placement complete, cheering not with the noise of celebration, but with a kind of satisfied murmur, the quiet acknowledgement of difficult work done correctly. The dangers of the work were real, though the record shows a program that took considerable care to guard against them. Divers worked in currents that could shift with tide and weather, sometimes suspending operations for days when conditions in the estuary turned unpredictable. Cold was a constant companion for much of the year, and workers on the lifting vessels and support boats often labored through weather that made the footing on wet steel decks its own quiet hazard. Meals were taken in shifts, according to accounts from the period, often simple fare eaten quickly between operations, since the tide and the currents did not wait for convenience, and a window for placement, once opened by calm water, might not return for days. What emerges from these accounts, read together, is less a story of individual heroism than one of accumulated, disciplined patience, exercised again and again across 65 separate placements, each one demanding the same exactness as the one before it. There was no room in this work for growing careless with familiarity. Every pillar carried the same risk as the first, and the engineers seemed to understand this, treating each placement as its own singular event, rather than another repetition of a solved problem. It is worth pausing, in the retelling, on the peculiar nature of the precision this work demanded. Centimeters, when measured against pillars this size, seem almost an absurd unit of concern. And yet it was precisely this scale of care, applied to structures of such overwhelming mass, that made the entire barrier possible. The sea does not forgive imprecision gently. A pillar set slightly wrong might stand for years before a slow imbalance revealed itself in a tilt, a crack, a shifting joint between structure and gate. The ocean, unlike so many of the forces engineers are asked to answer, keeps no schedule and offers no warning before it tests a flaw. It simply continues, tide after tide, wearing at whatever weakness has been left for it to find. And so precision, in this stretch of the Delta Works story, became something more than a technical requirement. It became, in its own quiet way, a form of patience translated into physical fact. The accumulated attention of surveyors, divers, engineers, and crane operators, each contributing some small, careful correction, so that when the pillar finally came to rest, it did so as though it had always belonged exactly there. Thousands of tons of concrete settled without argument onto a foundation built to receive it, waiting now for the gates that would one day span the distance between one pillar and the next, and complete, at last, the long threshold between the land and the sea. Between the pillars, at last, came the gates. 62 of them in all, curved steel structures, each measuring some 42 meters across and nearly 6 meters high, hung like great patient doors along the line the pillars had already claimed from the sea. They were not gates in the manner of a fence or a door swung on a single hinge. They were something stranger and more deliberate. Vast steel shells, shaped to the curve of the water they were meant to hold back, each one built to rest in a cradle at the base of its pillar when the sea was calm, low enough and hidden enough that ships could pass overhead and gulls could drift across the estuary without any sense that beneath the waterline 62 mechanisms waited in stillness, ready. The engineers who designed the gates had spent years turning over a single, quiet problem. How does one build a wall that does not wish to be a wall at all? A barrier that would rather not exist, that would rather let the tide come and go as it always had, and yet must be capable, at the first true warning of danger, of becoming something absolute. The answer they arrived at was not a fixed structure, but a breathing one, In fair weather, the gates lay lowered into their concrete cradles on the seabed, resting below the surface, and the estuary continued exactly as it had for centuries. The fishing boats went out. The tide moved through Oosterschelde twice a day as it always had. The mussel beds and cockle flats felt the same rhythm of ebb and flow they had felt long before any Dutchman had thought to measure the coastline. The barrier in this ordinary state was almost invisible. A traveller crossing the estuary might see the long procession of pillars marching across the water and think little more of it than they would a bridge, unaware that beneath their feet, in the quiet dark, 62 steel gates lay ready like folded wings. The mechanism that lifted them was, in its essence, simple, though the engineering behind that simplicity had taken years to earn. Each gate was raised and lowered along vertical guides fixed to the pillars on either side, driven by hydraulic systems housed within the pillars themselves. Pistons and pumps built to move thousands of tons of steel with a slow, deliberate certainty rather than any sudden violence. When the gates were needed, hydraulic pressure lifted them from their cradles, sliding them upward along the guide rails until they stood locked in place across the gap between the pillars, sealing the threshold from seabed to a height sufficient to turn back the storm surge above. The entire operation, gate by gate, all 62 working in coordinated sequence, could be completed within a matter of hours, monitored and directed by an operations center built specifically for this single purpose. A room of instruments and screens where a small number of trained hands could, when the moment came, close a barrier that had taken a decade to build. It is worth resting a moment on the philosophy folded into this design, because it was not the philosophy the Delta Works had begun with. The plan drawn up in the years after the flood of 1953 had called, at first, for a solid dam across the Oosterschelde, a permanent wall, fixed and complete, closing the estuary to the sea for good, in the same manner as the smaller closures already achieved elsewhere in the delta. Such a dam would have been simpler to build and, in purely technical terms, safer still, since a solid barrier holds no moving parts to fail. But as the years passed and the plans matured, a different voice grew louder, from biologists, from fishermen, from the communities who had lived along the Oosterschelde, depending on its tidal rhythms for their mussels, their oysters, their cockles, their entire manner of living with the water rather than simply beside it. A solid dam, they argued, would still succeed in holding back the storm, but it would also succeed in killing the estuary it protected, turning tidal water into a still and stagnant lake, ending the very ecosystem the coastline had sustained for longer than anyone could measure. The debate that followed was long and, by the standards of large public works, unusually reflective. It asked the country to weigh two forms of safety against each other: the safety of dry land against the surge, and the safety of a living ecosystem against a slow, administrative kind of extinction. The compromise that emerged after years of argument and revised engineering was the movable barrier, the gates that could close. It cost more. It took longer. It demanded a far greater precision of design, since a barrier with moving parts must be tested and trusted in a way a solid wall need not be. But it allowed the Oosterschelde to remain, in its ordinary hours, a living tidal estuary, its water still rising and falling with the moon, its shellfish beds still nourished by the same currents that had fed them for centuries. The wall, when finished, would not stand between the land and the sea as an ending of that relationship, but as a kind of negotiated peace, open in patience, closed only in danger. It was, in this sense, less like a fortress and more like an eyelid, designed to blink shut only when the wind and water demanded it, and to remain otherwise open to the ordinary passage of tide and light and time. The engineers spoke of this quality without embarrassment, though it was an unusual thing for engineers of that era to say so plainly, that they had built something meant to defer to nature rather than replace it, and that this deference had itself required a far greater feat of calculation than any simple wall. The first tests of the gates came gradually and without spectacle. Before any storm was permitted to approach the barrier, the gates themselves had to prove their obedience in calmer conditions, that they could be lowered smoothly into their cradles, lifted again along their guide rails, sealed evenly along their edges so that no gap remained for water to slip through under pressure. Engineers ran these trials repeatedly across the calm months, cycling gates open and closed under ordinary tidal conditions, watching the hydraulic systems respond, checking the alignment of each gate against its neighbors, measuring the seals for any imperfection that might, in a true storm, become a point of failure. Divers went down to inspect the cradles after each test, confirming that no debris or shifting sediment had settled where a gate needed to rest cleanly. None of this testing carried the drama of the flood the barrier had been built to answer. It carried, instead, the patient rhythm of proof, the same rhythm that had defined the entire project since the sinking of the first Phoenix caisson at Veer Gat, since the placement of the very first pillar. Each trial closure was a small rehearsal for a performance. The barrier hoped never to give in earnest, and yet had to be ready, without hesitation, to give at any hour the sea demanded it. When the full barrier was finally tested as a complete system, all 62 gates closing together in a coordinated exercise meant to simulate the sequence a true storm surge would require. The event passed with the same measured calm that had marked the entire construction. There was no crowd gathered to watch, no fanfare beyond the quiet satisfaction of the engineers monitoring their instruments in the operations center. The gates rose from their cradles in sequence, sealed against one another and against the pillars, and stood for a time as a solid wall where, hours before, open water had passed freely beneath the bridge of pillars above. Then, the test complete, they lowered again, and the estuary resumed its ordinary breathing. For the Delta Works as a whole, the completion of the Oosterschelde barrier marked something more than the closing of one estuary among several. It was the turning point of the entire project, the moment when the plan first conceived in the anxious months after the flood matured into something more considered than mere defense. The smaller dams built earlier at Veer Gat and Zandkreek had proven that the caisson method could hold back tidal water. The Oosterschelde barrier proved something further, that engineering, faced with a choice between total control and negotiated coexistence, could choose the harder, more patient path and succeed at it. It stood, when finished, not simply as the largest and most complex piece of the Delta Works, but as the philosophical center of the entire undertaking. Proof that the Netherlands intended not merely to survive the sea, but to continue living beside it, on terms neither wholly its own nor wholly the water's, but shared and carefully, endlessly maintained. Before the Oosterschelde could be closed by pillars and sliding gates, before engineers dared to imagine a barrier that breathed with the tide, other estuaries had to be sealed first, and by simpler means. The Delta Works, when described from a distance, can seem to move in a single unbroken line toward that final feat of restraint at the Oosterschelde. But the record shows something else, a slower, more experimental march across a decade and more, in which smaller mouths of the sea were closed first, and the lessons of each closure carried forward into the next. It is worth turning back now to those earlier gaps, to the Veersegat, the Grevelingen, and the Haringvliet, because it was there, in waters far less studied by history than the Oosterschelde, that the true method of the Delta Works was first tested and proven. The Veersegat was the first of the great tidal channels to be closed, in the years immediately following the flood, when the shock of the disaster was still close enough that every delay felt unacceptable. It was, by the standards of what would come later, a modest undertaking, a channel of moderate width separating the islands of Walcheren and Noord-Beveland, carrying tide but not the immense volume of water that moved through the mouths further south. And yet even here, the sea offered no easy entry. The channel bed shifted with every tide. The currents ran swiftly through the narrowing gap as the works advanced, and the engineers charged with closing it had, in truth, no complete precedent to follow. Dam building in tidal waters was not new to the Netherlands. The shaping of polders and the closing of small creeks had gone on for centuries. But a gap of this scale, in open, moving seawater, asked for something more deliberate than the accumulated wisdom of village dike builders. The method that emerged, and that would be refined and repeated across the works that followed, rested on an idea both simple and demanding. Rather than attempting to fill a channel gradually with loose material against a current that would only carry it away, engineers built massive concrete caissons on dry land nearby, towed them out on the tide, and sank them precisely into place at the single moment each day when the water itself grew calm. Slack tide, that narrow window, sometimes no longer than an hour, when the incoming and outgoing currents cancel each other and the water pauses, neither rising nor falling with force, became the working day of the entire endeavor. Everything before it was preparation. Everything after it was recovery and waiting for the next chance. The caissons themselves were extraordinary objects even before they touched water. Cast in specially built basins, they were floated free and towed by tug to the closing gap, positioned with a precision that left little margin for drift or misjudgment, and then flooded internally so that they settled and sank onto a bed that had, in turn, been carefully prepared in advance to receive them. Divers went down beforehand to inspect and smooth the channel floor. Surveyors watched currents for weeks to understand exactly how the water behaved as the gap narrowed, because a channel growing smaller does not behave as a wide one did. The same volume of water forced through a shrinking space moves faster, sometimes dangerously so, and the final caissons in any closure faced currents far stronger than the first ones had. It was for this reason that the sequence of placement mattered as much as the caissons themselves. Each one narrowed the gap further, and each narrowing changed the behavior of the tide for the next. At the Veersgat, this method was proved workable, though not without difficulty. Parts of the closure had to be reinforced and adjusted as currents shifted the sand around new obstructions in ways the engineers had not entirely anticipated. But it held, and by the time work began at the Grevelingen and later at the Haringvliet, the caisson method had matured into something closer to a discipline. At the Grevelingen, a wider and more forceful channel, the caissons grew larger, and the timing of their placement was calculated with even greater care, since a misjudged closing attempt risked not simply failure, but the loss of equipment and possibly life, to a current that could seize an improperly settled structure and drag it from position before it had time to fill and settle. The Haringvliet closure, wider still, and carrying the combined flow of major rivers behind it, as well as the tide before it, demanded caissons of a scale that strained the capacity of the shipyards and basins built to construct them, and a closing operation whose timing had to account not only for the sea's rhythm, but for the rivers as well, since fresh water and salt water met and moved together through that particular mouth in ways no single tide table could fully predict. What united all three of these closures, Veersgat, Grevelingen, Haringvliet, was not simply their engineering method, but the peculiar quality of risk involved in every closing day. There was no way to rehearse the actual sinking of a final caisson into a live tidal gap. Each attempt was, by necessity, a first and only attempt on the actual sea, at the actual mouth, on that particular day. Engineers could model currents, test scale replicas in laboratory flumes, and calculate the forces expected on paper with great confidence. But the moment the tugs released their tow lines and the caisson began its final settling into position, no instrument could substitute for the discipline of watching the real water and trusting the calculations that had brought the cruise to that hour. Workers who took part in these closures later recalled in interviews collected by regional archives the strange quiet that settled over a site in the final minutes before slack tide. Machinery idling, tugboat engines throttled low, everyone present watching the surface of the water itself for the subtle change that meant the moment had arrived. It was, by every account, not a moment of shouting or urgency, but one of stillness, in which an entire crew waited on the sea's permission before committing months of preparation to a single, irreversible act. When a closure succeeded, when the last caisson settled true, and the gap between islands became, within minutes, a stretch of open water where tide no longer passed. The reaction recorded at each site was one of quiet, weighted relief rather than celebration in any loud sense. Photographs from the Haringvliet closure and from the Grevelingen before it show small crowds gathered on temporary platforms and dike crests, workers and local residents together, watching the final caisson settle with the particular attentiveness of people who understood exactly what depended on its succeeding. There are accounts of applause, brief and almost surprised, breaking out at the moment the water's movement visibly stopped at the gap, and of engineers shaking hands without speeches, as if the achievement spoke sufficiently for itself, and needed no further ceremony layered on top of it. In a nation that had watched water take entire villages in a single night less than 2 decades before, the sight of a gap in the coastline finally closing for good carried its own quiet solemnity, one that did not require embellishment to be felt. Each of these closures, considered individually, might seem a modest chapter beside the grander drama of the Oosterschelde's movable gates. But their cumulative effect, considered together, was the true achievement of this middle period of the Delta works. Every gap sealed by caisson removed another length of exposed, vulnerable coastline from the map, another mouth through which a storm surge might once have driven inland with the same force that had overwhelmed the dikes in the flood of 1953. With the Veersegat closed, then the Grevelingen, then the Haringvliet, the province of Zeeland found its long, ragged edge of estuaries and islands steadily consolidated into a shorter, simpler line of defense, one that could be more easily reinforced, more easily watched, and more easily trusted. The engineers were not simply building individual dams. They were, closure by closure, redrawing the outline of a nation's exposure to the sea, shortening the length of coast that had to be defended by roughly the same fraction with each channel sealed. It was this arithmetic, the shrinking tally of open water, the lengthening tally of ground made safe, that gave the middle years of the Delta works their particular character. There was no single dramatic climax in this period, no moment comparable to the raising of the Oosterschelde's pillars or the sliding of its great gates into place. Instead, there was a steady, almost quiet accumulation of victories. Each one a caisson settled at slack tide, each one a gap that would never again carry a storm surge toward the towns and farmland behind it. It was patient work, suited to a patient nation, and it prepared both the engineers and the public for the greater, more delicate challenge that still lay ahead at the Oosterschelde, where a gap could not simply be sealed, but would instead have to be answered, span by span, with a gate willing to bend without breaking. By the time the Oosterschelde's great gates had settled into their rhythm, opening and closing with the tides, decades had passed since the flood that had first set the nation to its work. Children born in the year the waters rose were now grown, some of them engineers themselves, walking the same shorelines their parents had once measured with surveying rods and grief. The Delta works, as they had come to be called, were not finished. One stretch of coastline remained unanswered, though it was not a stretch of open sea at all, but the mouth of a working river, and the difficulty it posed was unlike anything the barriers before it had faced. The waterway in question was the Nieuwe Waterweg, the new waterway which carried ships from the North Sea into the harbour of Rotterdam, one of the busiest ports in the world. Here there could be no dam, no permanent wall, no structure that would ever fully close the passage to shipping. The harbour needed to breathe day and night, with tankers and container vessels moving through on schedules set by global trade, indifferent to the moods of the sea behind them. And yet the same waterway that fed the harbour was also a corridor through which a storm surge could travel, unimpeded, directly toward the low-lying city and the millions who lived within reach of its docks and streets. The engineers were asked, in effect, to build a door that would stand open for commerce nearly every day of the year, and yet close when called upon against the full weight of the sea. The structure that answered this problem was named the Maaslandkering, the Maasland Barrier, after the waterway it would guard, and it would not be finished until the final decade of the 20th century, long after the first caissons had settled into the Oosterschelde, and long after the flood itself had faded from living headline into national memory. It represented, in its design, a different philosophy entirely from the barriers that preceded it, where the Oosterschelde's engineers had built 62 vertical gates, raised and lowered like great portcullises between concrete piers. The engineers of the Maaslandkering conceived something closer to a pair of enormous doors, hinged at the banks, swinging inward across the water to meet in the middle when the sea demanded it, and swinging back out of the way when it did not. Each of these doors, called in the engineering drawings simply the arms, was a hollow steel structure larger than anything of its kind built before or since. Each arm stretched some 230 meters in length, longer than the height of the Eiffel Tower laid on its side, and each was built as a truss, a lattice of steel beams triangulated for strength, hollow enough that a person could walk through its interior chambers as through the corridors of a ship, and at the working end of each arm was fixed a steel gate, a floating wall in its own right, curved gently to meet the water's push, and broad enough to close half the width of the waterway when swung fully into position. When both arms met at the river's center, they formed a barrier stretching the entire breadth of the new waterway, sealing the passage as completely as any dam, though only for the hours the sea required it. The arms did not float freely, nor were they winched shut by cable and drum in the manner of a drawbridge. Each was mounted on a colossal ball joint, a sphere of cast steel larger than a small house, seated in a matching socket built into a concrete support on the riverbank. This ball joint allowed the arm to swing horizontally across the water, while also permitting a small, necessary give of tolerance, an ability to flex under load rather than resist it rigidly. Since a structure of such size, meeting the sea in anger, would need some capacity to breathe with the strain rather than fight it in stubborn stillness. The engineers who designed these joints spoke of them, in the technical literature that survives, as among the largest moving mechanical bearings ever fabricated for civil use, objects more commonly associated with the swiveling turrets of battleships or the rotating platforms of heavy industrial cranes than with a barrier meant to guard a river mouth. To move an arm of such mass required force on a scale that ordinary engineering rarely calls for. The solution the designers settled upon was not to push the arms directly with machinery at all, but to let the gates themselves do much of the work through buoyancy and controlled flooding. Each arm, when not in use, rested in a broad concrete berth or dry dock built into the riverbank, out of the shipping channel entirely, so that on any ordinary day, a vessel bound for Rotterdam would pass the site and see only the two great doors resting open, folded back against the shore, unremarkable as sleeping machinery. When a closure was called for, ballast tanks within the steel gates were allowed to fill with water, and the arms, now weighted, were swung slowly across the river by hydraulic drive. the ball joints turning with a patience that belied the scale of what was moving. Once in place, further ballast could be added, drawing the gates lower and sealing them more firmly against the riverbed, so that the barrier that had swung shut as a hollow, near-weightless structure became, once flooded and seated, one of the heaviest moving objects ever built by human hands, closing not with the suddenness of a slammed door, but with the unhurried certainty of something too large to be hurried. The question of when to close such a barrier could not, in the end, be left to a single harbour master watching the sky, nor to the accumulated instinct of engineers who had spent careers reading tides. The waterway needed to remain open for shipping in all but the most severe conditions, and closing it carried its own cost in delayed vessels and interrupted trade. So the decision could not be made too often nor too late. The nation that had built the Oosterschelde's gates by hand and eye now turned to a different kind of instrument to answer this problem. One built not of steel or concrete, but of calculation. A system of computer models was developed, drawing on data gathered from tide gauges, weather stations, and offshore buoys scattered along the coast and out into the North Sea itself, feeding a continuous stream of measurements into programs designed to forecast the height of an approaching surge hours before it arrived. If the models predicted that the water at Rotterdam would rise to a height of some 3 meters above the normal, a threshold set with the same patient caution that had guided every decision since the flood, the system would trigger the closure sequence automatically, without waiting for a human hand to give the order. The arms would swing, the ballast would fill, the river would be sealed, and only afterward, once the surge had passed and the models confirmed the danger gone, would the sequence reverse, the ballast pumped clear, the arms drawn back to their berths, and the shipping lanes reopened to the patient queue of vessels that had waited beyond the gates. This was, in its quiet way, as significant a development as any of the concrete or steel that had come before it, for it marked a shift in the philosophy of the entire project. The generation that had built the first dams by hand and had raised the piers of the Oosterschelde stone by sunk stone had built structures that depended, in their operation, on human presence and human judgment, engineers and lock keepers who watched the water and made the call. The Maislandkering was built to make that call itself, or nearly so, trusting the accumulated calculation of decades of data over the vigilance of any single watcher, however experienced. It was not that the engineers who designed it distrusted human judgment entirely. The system retained the ability for operators to intervene, to override, to close the barrier manually if the models faltered or the sea behaved in ways the numbers had not anticipated. But the default, the resting assumption built into the very logic of the structure, was one of trust in prediction, in the patient modeling of weather and water that had grown so much more precise in the 50 years since the flood first forced the question of the coastline. It is worth pausing over how much had changed, quietly, across those 5 decades of construction. The first dams closed at Zeeland had been built with cranes and barges and no small amount of improvisation. A nation relearning, storm by storm, how to answer the sea. By the time the Maislandkering rose at the mouth of the new waterway, the same nation was closing a barrier of unprecedented scale. Not with cranes at all, but with ballast tanks and ball joints and predictive software running on machines that would have seemed impossible to the engineers who first surveyed the Zeeland breaches. The project had not merely built one structure after another, it had evolved alongside the tools available to it, absorbing each new advance in materials, in modeling, in computation, and folding it into a design more ambitious than the one before. The Delta Works, considered as a whole, told the story not only of a coastline defended, but of an engineering culture maturing in real time, learning at every stage what the sea required and what the age's tools could offer in answer, until at last, at the harbour's mouth, Calculation itself stood watch, patient and untiring, over the doors that guarded Rotterdam. Behind every calculation, behind every model tested in the basins at Delft, behind every ton of concrete poured into the widening mouths of the estuaries, there were hands. The Delta Works, for all its scale and all its abstraction into numbers and tolerances and hydraulic coefficients, was raised by people who woke before dawn on work islands scattered through the Zeeland waters, who ate their breakfasts in the grey light before the barges began to move, and who gave, in many cases, the greater part of their working lives to a project that would not be finished within any single career. To speak only of the engineering triumph without speaking of the people who carried it out would be to describe a cathedral by its dimensions alone, and to say nothing of the masons who spent their winters on the scaffolding. The work islands, built specifically to house construction of the storm surge barriers, were strange and temporary settlements, thrown up in places that had been open water only months before. Neeltje Jans, the largest and best remembered of these islands, grew out of the Oosterschelde estuary as an artificial platform of sand and stone, built for the sole purpose of supporting the enormous concrete piers being cast nearby. At its height, it held not only the machinery of construction, but the infrastructure of a small town. Barracks, canteens, workshops, a chapel for those who wished to mark a Sunday, even amid the noise of pumps and cranes. Workers arrived by ferry or by causeway, some for weeks at a stretch, others for years. And many later spoke of the peculiar sensation of living on ground that had not existed a season before, ground that had been sea and would in some final configuration become sea again, sealed behind gates that these same hands were building. Wages on the Delta Works were, according to surviving payroll records and union accounts from the period, considered fair for the era, particularly for skilled trades, divers, riggers, crane operators, and concrete specialists, though the work itself carried burdens that no wage fully captured. The hours were long, dictated as much by tide as by shift schedule, since certain operations, particularly the placement of the enormous concrete piers and the laying of the mattress foundations beneath them, could only be carried out during specific windows of slack water, when the currents through the estuary mouths briefly stilled. This meant that labourers might be roused at 3 in the morning, because the tide, not the clock, had decided the day's true beginning. Foremen kept tide tables as carefully as calendars, and the entire rhythm of daily life on the islands bent itself around a schedule set by the moon. Isolation was, by every account that survives, one of the defining features of the work. Zeeland in the 1960s and 70s was rural, sparsely populated, its economy still recovering from the flood that had prompted the entire undertaking. Workers came from Rotterdam, from Amsterdam, from towns across the country, and for many, the assignment meant weeks away from family, reachable only by letter or, in later years, by the occasional telephone call routed through a shared island line. Diaries and oral history collections gathered by regional archives describe evenings spent playing cards in canteen barracks, radios tuned to distant stations, and the particular quiet of a place where, after the machines stopped for the night, there was little to hear but wind and water. One retired crane operator, interviewed decades later for a regional history project, recalled that the silence after the pumps shut down each evening was so complete that men new to the island often could not sleep for the first several nights, having grown too accustomed to the noise of the work to rest without it. Among the recorded voices, few carry as much quiet weight as those of the divers who worked beneath the surface of the estuaries, preparing the seabed for the piers and later inspecting the completed foundations for settlement or damage. The work was carried out in near total darkness, the estuary waters thick with sediment stirred by currents and construction alike, so that a diver's hands often did more work than his eyes. Visibility, according to several accounts, could fall to a few centimeters, meaning that the men worked essentially by feel, tracing the contours of the sunken mattresses and pier foundations with gloved fingers, checking for gaps, for erosion, for signs that the current had begun to undermine what had been so carefully laid. One diver, quoted in a retrospective account compiled by a Dutch engineering trade publication years after the barriers were completed, described descending into the Oosterschelde as being lowered into a world with no up and no down, where the only certainty was the rope at his back and the rhythm of his own breath. The training required for this work was considerable, and the risk, though managed carefully by the standards of the day, was real. Several near accidents are recorded in project safety logs, though the Delta Works maintained, by most historical assessments, a safety record notably better than comparable undertakings of its era, a fact often attributed to the rigor of its planning and the caution instilled by the memory of 1953. Meals, small as they may seem against the scale of the engineering, appear again and again in the personal recollections gathered from those years. Perhaps because shared food was one of the few comforts easily available on an island otherwise defined by machinery and labor. Workers ate together on barges and in canteen halls, simple meals of bread, soup, herring, and coffee poured from enormous urns that never seemed to run dry, according to more than one account. A photograph preserved in a regional maritime museum shows a group of laborers seated on crates aboard a supply barge, plates balanced on their knees, the unfinished pier of the Oosterschelde rising behind them, half submerged in scaffolding. It is an unremarkable image in most respects, and yet it captures something the technical drawings cannot: the ordinary human rhythm that ran beneath the extraordinary engineering, the fact that even a project meant to reshape the coastline of a nation was carried out one lunch break, one shift change, one card game at a time. The Delta Works, spanning as it did from the years immediately following the flood into the final decades of the 20th century, became in a very real sense a generational undertaking. Engineers who had begun their careers as junior draftsmen on the earliest dam closures in the 1950s were, by the time the Oosterschelde neared completion, senior figures training the next generation of hydraulic engineers who would go on to design the Maislandkering. Several family names recur across project records spanning decades. Sons who followed fathers onto the same work islands, sometimes into the same trades, occasionally even assigned, by coincidence or design, to stretches of coastline their fathers had helped secure years before. One such account, preserved in a Zeeland regional history archive, describes a father and son who worked, a generation apart, on the same section of the Eastern Scheldt. The father as a young labourer, helping to lay the earliest sand and clay closure dams in the 1950s. The son, decades later, as a technician assisting in the installation of the movable steel gates during the final phase of the barrier's construction. Between them lay nearly 30 years of evolving technique. Yet the water they worked against was, in its essential nature, unchanged. The same tides, the same currents, the same patient pressure of the sea against whatever was placed in its path. This generational continuity gave the Delta Works a character shared by few other infrastructure projects of its scale. It was not built in a single sustained push, the way a bridge or a tower might rise across a handful of years, but rather accumulated slowly across decades, absorbing new workers as older ones retired, new techniques as old ones were superseded, new understandings of tide and current as computational tools matured. The human patience required to sustain such an effort across generations was, in its own way, as remarkable as any technical achievement recorded in the project's engineering reports. Where the concrete and steel provided the physical form of the defense, it was this patience, inherited, passed down, renewed with each new cohort of engineers and laborers, that gave the project its true endurance. Workers understood, in ways the technical literature rarely states outright, that they were contributing to something whose completion they might not personally witness, whose final form existed only in projections and models that stretched years beyond their own service. And yet, according to the oral histories collected across the decades, morale on the work islands remained, by most accounts, remarkably steady, sustained by a shared sense of purpose that traced back always to the memory of the flood that had made the entire undertaking necessary in the first place. Every laborer working the sand and steel of the Delta works, whether newly arrived or nearing retirement, understood at some level that the effort was not abstract engineering ambition, but a direct, generational answer to a specific night in 1953, one that had drowned neighbors, cousins, and entire villages, and that would not be permitted to repeat itself if patience, skill, and steady hands had anything to say about it. By the time the final decades of the 20th century arrived, the coastline of the southwestern Netherlands no longer resembled the fragile, wind-worn edge of land that had given way so completely in 1953. What had once been a patchwork of low dikes, exposed islands, and tidal channels vulnerable to the sea's every mood had become something else entirely. A deliberate, engineered threshold between land and water, built not as a single wall, but as a system. A long chain of structures, each answering a different stretch of coast, a different depth of channel, a different demand of tide and current. The transformation had not happened quickly. It had taken more than 3 decades of steady work, extending across generations of engineers, laborers, and planners, many of whom had begun their careers on one estuary closure and ended them on another, watching the coastline change beneath their hands, one season at a time. And now, as the final barriers neared completion, it was possible, for the first time, to stand back and see the whole of it, not as a series of separate projects scattered along the map, but as a single continuous work, joined in purpose, if not always in form. The system that emerged was best understood not as one structure, but as a graduated sequence of responses, each suited to its portion of the delta. In the smaller estuaries, where the currents ran gentler and the ecological cost of a permanent closure was judged acceptable, solid dams had been raised. The Veerseegat, the Grevelingen, the Volkerak, each one sealing off a channel entirely, transforming what had been a tidal inlet into a still, freshwater basin, calm where it had once surged. These closures had come first, built in the 1950s and 60s, while the memory of the flood was still raw, and the political will to act decisively was at its strongest. They were simple in concept, though never simple in execution. Earth and stone brought in by barge and dropped in careful stages. The currents fought and diverted with cofferdams and caissons until the gap could finally be closed, and the water behind it allowed to settle into its new, quieter existence. But as the years passed and the engineering moved to the wider, deeper estuaries, Haringvliet, Oosterschelde, the response had to change. Here, the closures could not simply seal a channel outright, not when the ecological cost of doing so had become impossible to ignore, and not when the engineering itself demanded a more delicate touch. The Haringvliet had been given sluices, a long concrete structure of 17 individual gates capable of opening and closing in response to river discharge and tidal pressure, allowing fresh water from the Rhine and Meuse to continue reaching the sea while still offering protection against the highest surges. The Oosterschelde, larger and more ecologically significant than any of the other estuaries, had been given the storm surge barrier, the crowning technical achievement of the entire system. A 9-kilometer span of concrete piers and sliding steel gates that could remain open under ordinary conditions, allowing the tide to move freely in and out, the mussel beds and cockle flats to continue their ancient rhythms, and could close only when the sea threatened to rise beyond safe limits. It was, in its finished form, less a wall than a threshold, one that watched the water rather than simply blocking it, one that intervened only when intervention was truly necessary. Alongside the dams and barriers ran a quieter, less celebrated infrastructure that made the whole system function as something more than a collection of separate walls. Bridges had been built atop several of the closures, allowing roads to cross what had once been open water, connecting islands that for centuries had been reachable only by ferry, knitting the province of Zeeland into the rest of the country in a way it had never been before. Locks had been constructed at key points to allow shipping to pass between the newly separated basins, preserving the commercial traffic that had moved through these waters for generations, even as the waters themselves were reorganized and contained. Sluice gates, smaller and less monumental than the Great Barriers but no less essential, managed the daily exchange of fresh and salt water in dozens of locations, maintaining the delicate balance that agriculture, fisheries, and drinking water all depended upon. Seen together, the dams, the barriers, the bridges, the locks, and the sluices formed a single coordinated organism, one that had to be understood, not structure by structure, but as a whole, each piece calibrated against the others, each closure or opening upstream affecting the pressures and flows downstream in ways that had taken decades of hydraulic study to fully anticipate. It was in this later stage of construction that the ecological compromises embedded into the project became most visible and most consequential. The engineers of the 1950s, working in the shadow of catastrophe, had approached the delta with a singular purpose: to seal the gaps, to keep the sea out, to protect the land at almost any cost. But by the time work reached the Oosterschelde in the 1970s, the calculus had shifted. Fishermen whose livelihoods depended on the estuary's oyster and mussel beds had organized in protest against a solid closure. Marine biologists had begun to document, in increasing detail, the richness of the tidal ecosystem that a permanent dam would destroy. The flushing of nutrients with each tide, the spawning grounds, the delicate mixing of salt and fresh water that supported species found nowhere else in the delta. Public sentiment, once entirely focused on safety, had begun to make room for a second concern, one that asked not only how the land could be protected, but at what cost to the water itself. The result was a compromise built directly into steel and concrete, a barrier that could close, but that spent most of its existence open, allowing the tide to continue its ancient movement in and out of the estuary, preserving marshland, sandbank and channel in something closer to their original form than any of the earlier closures had allowed. It was, by any measure, a more expensive and more complicated solution than a simple dam would have been. But it reflected a lesson the nation had learned partway through its own great undertaking: that safety and preservation were not always opposites, and that a system built with enough patience could sometimes achieve both. As the last structures neared completion, the scale of what had been accomplished began to draw attention far beyond the borders of the Netherlands. Engineering bodies and professional societies, reviewing the delta system as a whole, the dams, the barriers, the bridges, the locks, the decades of hydraulic research that had guided every decision, recognized it among the great works of modern construction, placing it alongside canals, dams, and tunnels raised on far larger budgets by far larger nations. The distinction was not simply for scale, though the scale was considerable, but for the integration of the work. The way an entire coastline, spanning multiple estuaries and dozens of individual structures, had been conceived and executed as a single coherent response to a single defining threat. Few nations had attempted anything of comparable ambition against the sea, and fewer still had done so with the same patience, revising their methods mid-project as new understanding emerged. willing to slow construction and reconsider designs when new evidence suggested a better way. The recognition, when it came, was quiet by the standards of such honours, expressed largely within engineering circles and technical journals rather than in public fanfare. But it marked, nonetheless, a formal acknowledgement that what had been built along this modest stretch of European coastline stood among the defining engineering achievements of the century. And yet, even as that recognition settled quietly into the historical record, there remained a plainer truth beneath it, one the engineers themselves rarely spoke of but never forgot. The cost, in money and in years, that a small nation had willingly borne for the safety of its people. The Delta Works had consumed decades of national resources, drawing on the labour of thousands, absorbing budgets that stretched across generations of government and reshaping the very geography of a province. It had asked of the Netherlands a sustained commitment that few democracies managed to maintain across so many changing administrations, so many shifting economic conditions, so many competing demands for public funds. That the commitment had held, year after year, decade after decade, spoke to something beyond engineering. A shared understanding, worn into the national memory by the flood itself. That this was not a project that could be paused, delayed, or abandoned halfway. The nation had built, not because it was easy, and not because the cost was small, but because the alternative, remembered clearly by everyone old enough to recall the winter of 1953, was no longer acceptable. The system now stood complete: dams and barriers, bridges and locks, sluices and gates, spread across a reshaped coastline. And behind every span of concrete and every closing gate lay that same quiet, unspoken reckoning of what had been spent and why it had been worth spending. The years that followed completion did not bring silence to the Delta Works, though from a distance the coastline seemed to settle into a kind of calm that the country had not known for centuries. The barriers stood, the dams held, and the rivers and tidal channels moved beneath and around them according to patterns that engineers had studied and measured for decades. But the sea had not been persuaded to stop testing what had been built against it. It came back, as it always had, in storms that gathered over the North Atlantic and swept toward the Dutch coast with the same indifference that had driven the flood of 1953. The difference now was that the coastline had an answer prepared: gates that could rise or fall, barriers that could close on command, and a system of monitoring that watched the water every hour of every day, waiting to see whether the numbers would call for action. The Oosterschelde barrier, with its 62 great gates hung between concrete piers, was designed from the outset to remain open under ordinary conditions, allowing the tide to move through as it always had, preserving the mussel beds and the oyster grounds and the delicate ecology of the estuary that the engineers and the biologists had fought so hard to protect. Only when the sea rose past a certain threshold, only when the storm's surge threatened to overwhelm the land behind it, would the gates begin their slow descent, sealing the estuary against the water until the danger passed. In the years since its completion, that closing has happened only a small number of times. Each one recorded, each one studied afterward by the engineers who maintain the system. Each one a quiet vindication of the decades of calculation that had gone into the barrier's design. The gates have closed during storms in which the surge pushed dangerously high along the Dutch coast. Moments when the difference between a closed barrier and an open estuary could have meant water pouring into towns and farmland that had already been flooded once, within living memory, and had no wish to be flooded again. Each closure lasted only as long as necessary. The tide held back until the danger passed, and then the gates rose once more, and the estuary breathed again, and the water moved through as it always had. Further south, at the mouth of the Nieuwe Waterweg, the Maesland barrier waited in its own quiet readiness, its two great arms resting in their dry docks on either side of the channel, ready to swing shut on computer command if the water at Rotterdam rose past the level the system had been built to tolerate. Because it protected not an estuary of mussel beds, but a city of nearly 1 million people and one of the busiest ports in the world, the Maasland barrier had been given an automated system, one that did not wait for human deliberation in the final hours before a storm, one that watched the sea level constantly and triggered the closing sequence itself. If the numbers crossed the threshold that centuries of flood record and decades of modelling had established as the point beyond which the risk could not be tolerated, it had closed only rarely since its completion. The storms that would have justified it being, by the ordinary measure of a lifetime, uncommon events. But when it did close, the world took note, because the closing of a barrier of that size was itself a kind of proof, a demonstration that the machinery built at such enormous cost and left largely untested for years at a stretch, still answered when it was called upon. The barrier's own history includes a closure during a storm in the closing years of the 20th century that brought water levels at Rotterdam high enough to trigger the automated sequence, the two great arms swinging slowly across the channel until they met and sealed the waterway, holding back a surge that might otherwise have pushed into the heart of the city. It was, by the account of those who watched it, an unremarkable event in the sense that nothing failed, nothing cracked, nothing had to be forced. The gates closed as they had been designed to close, and the water was held, and afterward they opened again, and the ships returned to the channel, and the ordinary business of the port resumed as though the closing had been nothing more than a formality, which in its way it was, though it had taken half a century of study and construction to make it so. There is a particular kind of discipline required to maintain confidence in a system built to perform so rarely. A bridge is tested every day by every vehicle that crosses it. A dam holding back a river is tested every hour by the water pressing against it without pause. But a storm surge barrier, built to close only when the sea rises past a threshold that may be reached only a handful of times in a generation, carries a different burden. Its gates may stand open for years, its machinery resting, its computers watching numbers that rarely approach the level that would call them into service, and yet the barrier must remain ready at every moment, because the one closure it fails to make correctly is the one that matters. This is the quiet vigilance that the Delta Works demanded of the nation that built it. A vigilance measured not in constant use, but in constant readiness, and it has been maintained through an ongoing program of testing, inspection, and rehearsal that treats every barrier and every gate as though the next storm might come at any time, regardless of how long it has been since the last one closed. The Maasland barrier, in particular, undergoes a closing trial each year, a rehearsal in which the two great arms swing across the channel. Not because a storm demands it, but because the engineers who maintain the system insist on confirming, season after season, that the machinery still answers as it should, that the computer models still calculate the thresholds correctly, that the hinges and the ballast chambers and the enormous steel structures still move as they were built to move. This annual test has become its own quiet ritual, a demonstration performed not for an audience, but for the sake of the certainty it provides, a way of ensuring that, when the sea does rise, the barrier does not discover, in that moment, some flaw that decades of calm had allowed to go unnoticed. The Oosterschelde barrier undergoes its own program of inspection, divers and engineers checking the piers and the gate mechanisms, the concrete examined for wear, the steel examined for corrosion, the entire structure treated as a living system that requires attention rather than a finished monument that can simply be left to stand. Behind this, maintenance lies a broader effort that has occupied Dutch engineers and scientists since the completion of the works. An ongoing study of the sea itself, its levels, its patterns, its slow, long-term rise, measured across decades of tide gauge records along the coast. The thresholds that were calculated in the middle of the 20th century, the numbers that determined how high a dike needed to stand or how strong a barrier needed to be, were built on the best understanding available at the time, an understanding drawn from a century of storm records and probability calculations that had never before been applied so rigorously to coastal defense. But the sea does not remain still across the span of a human lifetime, and the scientists who monitor it now speak of a slow rise in average levels that must be accounted for if the barriers built decades ago are to remain adequate for the decades still to come. This has meant a continuing conversation between the original design and the evolving understanding of what the coast will face. A conversation carried out through commissions and studies that revisit every few years the assumptions on which the entire system was built, asking whether the standards set in the aftermath of the flood of 1953 remain sufficient, or whether the dikes must be raised further, the barriers reinforced, the thresholds recalculated to account for a sea that is not simply cycling through its old patterns, but shifting, gradually, into something the original engineers could only partially anticipate. This is, perhaps, the quietest and least visible part of the Delta Works, the part that leaves no concrete pier or steel gate for a visitor to admire, but which may in the end matter as much as anything poured or forged during the decades of construction. It is the recognition, built into the very governance of the project, that the system could never be considered finished in the way a bridge or a building is finished, that the barriers and dams would need to be watched, tested, adjusted, and in some cases eventually raised or rebuilt as the sea itself continued to change around them. The nation that had built the Delta Works in response to a single catastrophic night had learned, in the decades since, to think of coastal defense not as a project with an end date, but as an ongoing relationship with the water, one that would require attention for as long as people continued to live behind the dikes. The Delta Works, in this sense, remains unfinished, not because the concrete was never poured or the gates never closed, but because the sea against which it stands guard has never stopped moving, never stopped rising, never stopped requiring the kind of patient, continuous vigilance that had first been demanded on that terrible night when the water came without warning and found the old defences wanting. News of what the Netherlands had built did not stay within its own borders for long. Engineers elsewhere had watched the project rise across the decades, at first with a kind of polite skepticism, and later with the close attention that professionals reserve for work they suspect they will one day need to copy. The scale of the Delta Works, the audacity of closing entire sea arms with movable barriers rather than simple fixed walls, and the patient decades of study that had gone into understanding how sand, water, and concrete would behave together, made the project a kind of open laboratory for anyone whose nation also faced the sea. Delegations came from Britain, where the same North Sea that had drowned Zealand had also pressed against the Thames estuary and the low country of East Anglia. They came from the United States, where the Army Corps of Engineers, custodians of levees and flood walls along rivers and coastlines from Louisiana to the Chesapeake, found in the Dutch approach a way of thinking about water that differed sharply from the American tradition of building walls simply higher and thicker. They came too from Japan, from Italy, from countries with river deltas and typhoon coasts, all drawn by the same recognition that a small nation with limited land and enormous exposure to the sea had, through decades of unglamorous calculation, produced something that worked, and worked in a way that seemed to promise lessons transferable to other coastlines, entirely unlike the Netherlands in culture and geography, but identical in the basic problem of land lying low against rising water. The influence showed itself most clearly in London, where the Thames Barrier, completed in the early 1980s, drew directly on the closable gate philosophy that Dutch engineers had proven at Oosterschelde. and would soon refine further at the mouth of the Nieuwe Waterweg. The Thames Barrier's rising sector gates, engineering marvels in their own right, owed a conceptual debt to the Dutch insistence that a barrier need not be a permanent wall to be effective. It could instead be a structure that remained open to the ordinary rhythms of tide and shipping, closing only when the specific threat of a surge demanded it. This was, in its way, the same philosophical shift the Dutch themselves had made at Oosterschelde, when public pressure and ecological concern had forced engineers to abandon the solid dam in favor of the storm surge barrier, preserving the tidal life of the estuary while still protecting the land behind it. London's engineers studied this compromise closely, and though the Thames Barrier's design differed in its mechanics, rising rather than swinging, the underlying lesson that flood defense and environmental preservation were not necessarily in conflict traveled from Zealand to the Thames estuary largely intact. In the United States, the influence proved less a matter of direct imitation and more a slow reconsideration of assumptions. American engineers, trained in a tradition that favored massive, fixed structures, levees built high and left to stand, found in the Dutch system a different set of questions. Rather than asking simply how high a wall needed to be to hold back a given storm, the Dutch approach asked what the acceptable risk of failure was for a given stretch of coastline, calculated in probabilities measured across centuries and then built accordingly, with certain barriers designed to withstand events expected only once in 10,000 years, and others calibrated to lesser but still severe risks. This probabilistic thinking, embedded in Dutch engineering standards since the years immediately following the flood of 1953, gradually found its way into American coastal planning, particularly after Hurricane Katrina exposed catastrophic weaknesses in the levee systems protecting New Orleans in 2005. In the aftermath of that disaster, American engineers and planners traveled to the Netherlands in numbers that echoed the earlier delegations of decades before, seeking to understand not just the physical barriers the Dutch had built, but the underlying philosophy of risk management that had produced them. The rebuilding of New Orleans's flood protection system in the years that followed drew, in places, on Dutch consultation and Dutch thinking, though American political and financial realities meant the translation was never complete nor uniform. Placed within the larger history of human efforts to hold back water, the Delta Works occupies a position that invites comparison to the very oldest defensive structures built by any civilization. The walls raised against invading armies, the fortifications that guarded cities against siege, these had always been understood as monuments to human ingenuity in the face of human threat. The Delta Works belonged to a quieter but no less ancient tradition, the long contest between land and sea that predates recorded history, in which every civilization built along a low coastline has had to reach some accommodation with the water at its border. The polders of the Netherlands, some reclaimed from the sea centuries before the Delta Works was ever conceived, were themselves a form of this contest, land wrested from water through patient diking and pumping, a slow victory measured in generations rather than in single dramatic acts. The Delta Works represented, in this light, not a new war, but the latest and most sophisticated campaign, in a struggle stretching back to the medieval monks and farmers who had first raised earthen dikes along the Zealand coast, and further back still to whatever unrecorded peoples had first learned that mounding earth above the waterline could keep a settlement dry through a winter storm. Yet even as engineers elsewhere studied and adapted the Dutch example, the ground beneath the entire achievement had already begun, by the final years of the 20th century, to shift in ways that no closing ceremony could address. The climate that had produced the storm of 1953 was not the same climate the Netherlands now faced, and Dutch engineers, along with the government bodies that had commissioned the Delta Works, found themselves confronting a new and more unsettling category of uncertainty. Not simply the question of how high a storm surge might rise in a given century, but the question of how much the baseline sea level itself would climb as global temperatures increased, ice sheets thinned, and ocean water expanded with warmth. This was a different order of problem from the one the original engineers had faced. The 1950s calculations had assumed a sea level that, while capable of violent surges, remained essentially stable over the long term, rising and falling with tides and storms around a fixed average. By the early 21st century, that assumption no longer held. The average itself was moving, and moving in a direction that made every existing barrier a structure built for a sea that was quietly leaving its old boundaries behind. The Dutch response to this new uncertainty followed the same pattern of institutional patience that had characterized the entire history of the Delta works. Rather than treating rising seas as a crisis demanding immediate and drastic new construction, Dutch water authorities incorporated the uncertainty into long-range planning frameworks that stretched, in some cases, a full century into the future. The Delta Program, established in the early 21st century as a successor to the original Delta Works Commission, operated on the assumption that flood defense decisions made in any given decade needed to remain flexible enough to accommodate sea level projections that might shift significantly as climate science advanced. Barriers were designed, where possible, with the capacity for future heightening. Dike reinforcement schedules were built around decision points spaced decades apart, at which point new data on sea level rise would be reviewed and construction plans adjusted accordingly. This was, in its way, the same philosophy that had guided the original Delta works from its beginning. Not the illusion of a final, permanent solution, but a continuously renewed commitment to watching the water and adjusting the defenses to match what was actually happening, rather than what earlier generations had assumed would happen. It would be dishonest, in surveying this long history, to claim that the questions raised by a changing climate have been resolved, or that Dutch engineers today speak with the same confidence about the coming century that their predecessors once spoke about the flood risks of the 1950s. The projections for sea level rise carry genuine uncertainty, with credible estimates varying considerably depending on how quickly global emissions are reduced and how ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica respond to continued warming. Some Dutch scientists and engineers have expressed confidence that the existing system, with planned reinforcements, can adapt to the more moderate projections well into the next century. Others have raised more urgent warnings, suggesting that certain barriers, including the storm surge gates themselves, may need more radical reworking sooner than current planning assumes, particularly if the more severe rise scenarios prove accurate. The debate remains open, conducted in engineering journals and government reports rather than settled by any single authoritative pronouncement. And honest accounts of the Delta works today must acknowledge this open question rather than pretend the matter has been resolved. What can be said with more certainty is only this, that the same patient, unglamorous vigilance that built the barriers in the first place continues in laboratories and planning offices across the Netherlands to measure, model, and reconsider what the sea is likely to do next, carrying forward into an uncertain future the same lesson the water had first taught, without warning, on a night in 1953, when low country met high water and found itself unprepared. Morning comes quietly to the estuaries of Zeeland now, the way it has come for thousands of mornings since the last of the barriers was finished, and the engineers packed away their instruments and went home. The water laps against the concrete pillars of the Oosterschelde barrier in small, unhurried movements. The same water that once rose without mercy over the polders, now moving beneath the great gates like something that has been asked, gently but firmly, to behave. Gulls stand along the tops of the piers in the pale light. A fishing boat passes beneath one of the 62 openings, its wake spreading out across water that shows no memory, on its surface at least, of what it once did to this coastline. The concrete has weathered to a soft grey, streaked here and there with the pale mineral trails that seawater leaves on stone over the years, and where barnacles and mussels have taken hold along the lower reaches of the piers. The structure has become, in its own quiet way, part of the ecosystem it was built to hold at bay. It does not look, on such a morning, like a wall that stopped a nation from drowning. It looks like something that has always been there. The way a river looks as though it has always run its course. The way old stone bridges look as though they grew from the ground rather than having been raised, plank by plank and pile by pile, by human hands. And yet it was not always there. It is worth pausing in these final quiet moments to remember how far the distance runs between that lapping water in the morning light and the water that came in the dark of the night of the 1st of February, 1953, when a spring tide and a violent northwesterly wind combined to push the North Sea over dikes that had stood, in some cases, for centuries and had never been tested against a combination of forces quite so severe. The flood that followed took, by the counts that survive in the records, more than 1,800 lives in the Netherlands alone, and left tens of thousands without homes, and drowned livestock in numbers that were never fully tallied and reshaped in a single terrible night. The way an entire nation thought about the sea that had given it so much of its trade and so much of its history. It is easy, so many decades later, standing at the edge of a calm estuary with gulls overhead and children fishing from a jetty nearby, to forget how raw that grief was, how urgent the question became in its aftermath. How quickly a country that had always lived in a careful, negotiated peace with the water found itself asking whether that peace could ever be trusted again. The Delta works, in their earliest form, were not born from ambition or from a desire to build something extraordinary for its own sake. They were born from that grief, and from the plain, unavoidable arithmetic of a low country facing a sea that had shown, once and for all, what it was capable of doing when the old defenses failed. From that beginning, the story that unfolded is one this account has tried to tell slowly, the way it happened, without rushing past the parts that were difficult or uncertain or slow to resolve. It is the story of a coastline studied inch by inch, of estuaries mapped and remapped as engineers tried to decide which openings could be closed outright and which needed to remain open for the sake of the fisheries and the ecosystems that depended on the tidal flow. It is the story of ground beneath water that would not hold a foundation without decades of study and testing, of caissons sunk into soft riverbed silt, of mattresses of willow and nylon laid across the seabed to keep the currents from scouring away what had been so carefully placed. It is the story of concrete mixed and poured by the hundreds of thousands of cubic meters, of stone quarried and shipped from Scandinavia and from within the Netherlands itself, of sand dredged and pumped and shaped into islands that had not existed before the project began, and that today host visitor centers and grazing sheep as though they had always been part of the landscape. It is the story of the storm surge barriers that rose across those estuaries, the piers and pillars, driven down through soft ground to bedrock or to layers firm enough to bear the weight of steel gates that can, when the sea threatens, swing shut in a matter of hours. It is the story of the Oosterschelde barrier in particular, the compromise structure that took longer to design and longer to build than anyone expected. Because a nation that had once simply wanted the sea kept out came, over the years of debate that followed the first plans, to understand that keeping the sea out entirely would kill the very estuary it was trying to protect, and that the harder, more patient solution, the one that let the tide breathe in and out under ordinary conditions and only closed against the worst of storms, was the one worth the additional years and the additional cost. It is the story, too, of the Maasland Barrier at Rotterdam, built decades after the first works were finished, using computers and hydraulic systems that the original planners of the 1950s could not have imagined, and yet answering to the very same question that had driven the whole project from its first days. How does a low country, built partly below the level of the sea that borders it, protect what it has built without losing what makes that low country worth protecting in the first place? And it is the story of years, ordinary years, spent by ordinary people, welders and divers and crane operators and young engineers straight from university, working through summers and winters on islands built for the purpose, eating meals in canteens raised on stilts above the tide line, going home on weekends to families who had, in many cases, lived through the flood themselves and understood, without needing to be told, why the work mattered. It is a story that took not months but decades to complete, spanning from the first commission formed in the weeks after the flood through the final closing ceremonies of the last barriers in the 1980s and beyond. A stretch of time long enough that some of the men who began the project as young engineers retired before it was finished, and some of the workers who poured the earliest concrete did not live to see the last stone set in place. What remains, when all of that history is set aside and the coastline is looked at simply as it exists today, is a system that asks something of the country that built it beyond mere maintenance. It asks for patience, the same patience that raised it in the first place, because the barriers are not finished the way a building is finished, standing complete and needing only to be admired. They are finished the way a promise is finished, requiring renewal, requiring inspection, requiring the same slow vigilance year after year that first coaxed the design out of decades of study. It asks for calculation, the unglamorous kind, the sort that does not appear in photographs of ribbon cuttings or ministerial visits. The modeling of rising seas and shifting sediment and changing storm patterns that continues quietly in laboratories and planning offices long after the concrete has cured and the gates have proven themselves against the first tests of wind and tide. And it asks, perhaps most of all, for humility. The same humility that the flood of 1953 forced upon a nation that had believed its old dikes sufficient, and that the barriers themselves, for all their scale and ingenuity, cannot fully claim to have earned once and for all. The sea does not sign treaties. It does not agree to remain the size it was when the barriers were designed, or to arrive only in the patterns the models predicted. It rises, or it does not, according to forces the builders of the Delta works could study but never fully command. And so the coastline they left behind remains, in its own quiet way, an argument still being tested, a question the water may yet ask again in a form no one has fully anticipated. For now, though, on a morning like this one, the argument holds. Somewhere among the pillars of the Oosterschelde barrier, one of the great steel gates stands open beneath a quiet sky, its lower edge just clear of the water, the tide moving through the gap as it has moved through that estuary for longer than any human structure has stood to measure it. The gate is not idle. It waits, the way it has waited through every ordinary day since it was lowered into place, ready to close within hours if the sea and the wind ever again conspire the way they did on that night in 1953. It asks nothing of the gulls resting on its beams, or the boats passing beneath it, or the quiet water lapping at its feet. It simply stands, patient and prepared, a piece of engineering shaped by grief and calculation and decades of careful work, holding open the peace it was built to keep, for as long as the sea allows. If you have found some quiet in this long telling of water and stone, there are other great structures waiting on this channel, other slow stories of ground and gravity, and the patient hands that built against them whenever you might wish to return.